Roderick remembered the day Lord Stark first brought his sons to the courtyards to begin their martial training. Just as he remembered a similar day, decades ago, when it was the young Eddard's first day in the yard, and his older brother's first day before him still, the memory made him feel his age, and a sense of dulled grief lingered in his mind. He considered it an honor to train not one, but 2 generations of Starks, a line as ancient as the mists and the rivers, and him nothing more than an old soldier of a minor house with his best days behind him. There was the 5-year-old heir, bright blue eyes wide with curiosity and head of auburn hair held high. Then there was the Lord's base-born son, though the Lord told Roderick to treat them both equally. He never thought young, quiet Ned had it in him to betray his marriage vows. But war was hard and men were weak, even Starks. At the very least he had taken the boy in and given him a family. Most men would have ignored the consequences of their lusts. Others would have taken far darker paths. At the time, he thought him quite unremarkable, a waif of a child, an inch or 2 shorter than his true-born brother. In his first month, the boy struggled with the weight of the short wooden blade. His movements were clumsy and uncoordinated, and he failed to take to even simple instruction. In truth, he imagined the boy would put down the blade after a year or 2, mayhaps find himself better suited to letters or sums. His true-born brother was a different story. Now there was the making of a lord, both kind and intelligent, strong and quick, the delight of both his family and the castle staff, and he took to sword work like a fish to water. But as a further testament to the young boy's character, he did not lord his skill over base-born brother. None cheered louder for young John in his spars, and none sooner rushed to his side when he was bested time after time. Then one day, after war was called and won in winter had gone as quickly as it had arrived, a Greyjoy would become the newest addition to the training yards, a most despicable house, but Roderick tried not to hold the child responsible for his family's black past. He was a few years older than the boys, but still far too young to train with the men-at-arms or adolescents, and he gave the bastard something he seemed to need more than a helpful hand or a supportive word. He gave him a villain. For the young heir of the Iron Islands was unlike the heir to the north in every way, arrogant where the other was humble, harsh where the other kind. He took no small pleasure in demolishing the mediocre young swordsman as quickly and efficiently as he could, and took even greater pleasure in mocking and ridiculing the boy, no matter how many times Roderick told him off. Some would have folded under the weight of his presence, taken any excuse to avoid training or even the yard itself, but pressure seemed to be where the young son of Lord Stark thrived. He kept coming in day after day, no matter what the ward did or said, only he started paying attention to the lessons rather than mindlessly gazing off. He would freely consult the other boys for advice, and he would be in the yard hours before the other boys, sometimes before even Roderick managed to drag himself out of bed, endlessly honing and repeating the movements and routines until they became second nature. He tried to foster the growth, but he still did not expect much to come of it. Most likely the boy would give up, or at least slow down after a month. When he saw that the results were not immediate, and they were not, he would still occasionally lose to boys a couple years his junior, and Greyjoy's laughs still echoed through the yard. But he maintained the pace far longer than Roderick could have hoped for, driven by something or another. Soon he stopped losing bouts to boys younger than him, but still Luwin told him that the boy spent hours in the library studying ancient fighting manuscripts under candlelight. He perfectly executed a flurry of footwork for the first time, but still the servants told him that they saw a shadow dancing in the training yards under starlight. He bested his brother for the first time, but still, the boy could be seen balancing along fences and the stables and climbing back to his feet no matter how many times he tumbled into the mud and summer snow. And the better he grew, the more Roderick noticed the talent that had been shrouded under bad form, talent that he should have spotted sooner, reflexes that were almost animal in speed, a natural inclination towards explosive movement, an instinct that did not allow him to hesitate in a fight. He did not relent, nor give his opponent a chance to think, something which was impossible to teach some but that came to the boy innately. Combined with his growing technical skill, it made him a terror on the fields. Soon even Theon would find himself choking on his words, but Jon did not stop. It was a blend of dedication and potential that Roderick could not resist fostering. He found himself spending more time with the boy, walking him through styles, feints and routines that would make any other boy his age give up after being told they were nowhere close even on their 20th attempt. But Jon was not other boys. He relished in trying to learn them. There was a mania in his eyes when practicing an impossible flurry, and while he would come nowhere close to mastery, not at this young age, he still learned from his countless fails, be it explosive attacks, a superior understanding an opponent's range or near effortless movement, that much was clear when one watched his spars. There came a day where he lost a bout, and then he did not lose again, no matter who or how many Castle put him up against. It was not brought about by one single thing. He had not learned a secret technique that brought him victory in every contest. He had not harnessed his natural talents to the point that they made him unstoppable, nor had the countless hours of drilling his fundamentals made his footwork impossible to best. Rather, it was a combination of all those things, the fruit of talent, determination, and work that put him a league above the other kids. That was when Lady Stark approached him and politely asked him to consider paying less attention to the boy. Roderick respected the woman greatly, and there were many things he liked about her, but the boy was his father's ward, and thankfully he had decades of experience dealing with upset mothers, and quelled her worries as best he could. She said something about Demon Blackfire being a better swordsman than his trueborn brother, but Roderick had openly scoffed at the thought. When he looked at them, he did not see the seeds of Demon and Daeron, rather a young Lyanna and Brandon or Benjen and Ned, siblings that grew up together and bled for each other. Lord Stark understood that well enough. What did worry him was the youth's wolf blood. When he was young, he was a tame, timid child, but the growing skill had left him with an aggression that reminded him more of young Brandon than of young Eddard, more of Theon the hungry wolf than the king who knelt. The one thing that alleviated his concerns was that the boy's kindness remained his most defining feature. He might fight with a certain brutality, but Roderick never allowed him to be harsh or condescending towards his downed opponents, and as long as that remained, his confidence would never turn to arrogance nor cruelty. The next day, the Lord himself had taken some time to come see the boys spar. He nodded when Greyjoy felled a boy, offered a rare, warm smile when he saw Robb holding his own and eventually besting a far larger boy, but was absolutely gobsmacked to see Jon carve through 3 other boys as though they were wielding spoons. Roderick worried for a moment, but then the Lord's surprise would turn to pride and respect, genuine happiness that came to any father watching their blood excel. The boy only gave his father a wink, then turned back talk with his brother and peers. The boy does not lack for flair. He thought if the gods were good, it would not lead him to an early grave. Soon, the youngest Stark girl became a regular at the training fields when her mother grew pregnant again. Sansa would come and go with his and Pool's daughters sometimes, and he entirely disliked the giggles he heard when the boys teased the girls, but thankfully their visits grew rarer as they began their education of the womanly arts. The wild little girl, however, lived on the field, and always tried to play with the swords and padded armor, and she held none of the reservations her sister had about screaming at the top of her lungs for her brothers. The girl kept up Jon's spritz for a time, but the longer his reign of terror lasted, the more Roderick started to see it, the regression of old habits, the slow erosion of discipline. Every day he showed up a little later and left a little sooner. He asked fewer and fewer questions, and when there were none left who could even scratch him, the embers in his eye had faded. Roderick could have left it at that. He had already spent much effort on the boy, more than his lord had asked of him, and he would still make for a great swordsman regardless. Perhaps something would naturally come along and motivate him anew. But he had seen something in the boy, something he had hoped to see in Robb, or in a young Lord Stark, even in his own nephew Jory or the countless boys he trained. He saw it in young Brandon an age ago. Though in Jon it was as potent as wildfire, it could mature into a whirlwind that could carve through great swordsmen like butter, but if left to stagnate, especially at such a developmental age, the potential would remain forever unfulfilled. Lord Stark had said to treat them equally, and were his and Robb's positions reversed, he would not hesitate to afford the heir the effort. So, one day, Jon would come in late once more and Roderick would inform him that his training would start in the afternoon, and that his lessons with Luwin would be in the mornings instead. When the boy returned a few hours later, the field was filled with armored men who towered overhead, alongside their sons of 13 and 14 who would soon join the household guard and men-at-arms. Part of him was expecting the child to be afraid of the new, older people, of the absence of his brother and friends, but another part knew the boy's spirit well, and when an older boy of 15 threw the young 10-year-old Jon off his feet, he saw the fire in his eyes alight anew, and Roderick knew that he had made the right choice. He soon returned to his fanatical training, but now he was bigger, quicker, stronger, and the grown men with many wars behind them had more to teach the lad than the summer children he was used to facing. As such, his growth was faster and the ceiling seemed higher still. He even surpassed Roderick's expectations for him. He had given him a month before he won his first bout, but he bested a chubby boy of 13 in his first week. And it was much the same for the next few years. In his first year he would manage to fell an adult guardsman, something that earned the man no small amount of ridicule, but he would not have to endure it for long. Within another year more guardsmen had fallen to him than not, though that outcome remained a rarity until the year after, where he started winning more fights than he lost. His body and strength also grew rapidly in this time. As he reached that age where boys grew into men, he ate enough for two, and he took some hours helping the stonemasons carry stones from the quarry and lumberjacks haul timber from the woods to grow his strength further, as well as helping Micken hammer away at his steel. The household were not the only ones he sharpened his skill against. The north was a sparsely populated kingdom, but Winterfell was its capital castle, and many a traveling swordsman would pass through the castle and town. It became a frequent jest among the men to employ some of them to give the lad some lessons, only to fall to him in a duel. It was also during this time when he started trying different weapons, axes, hammers, spears, greatswords, and maces, and as time wore on he started experimenting in his spars to find his own style, perhaps a spear like the Viper or a greatsword like Arthur Dane, perhaps a sword and a dagger like the Kingslayer or a greatsword and a shortsword, a particularly devastating combination that Roderick barred him from sparring with after he nearly gave a grown man a concussion. He had also been taught the basics of horsemanship when he was younger, but he reapplied himself during those years, crushing lances into stationary targets at first, then to bags of pebbles that swung loosely from tree branches. His relatively average riding was holding him back from being truly extraordinary with a lance, but perhaps he would address that as he grew. Then there were those days that started to occur, rare at first, but growing more frequent with time and age, the days where the potential Roderick saw hints of a decade ago manifested into being, and the boy managed to integrate everything he had learned, the thousands of hours of practice, the countless words of instruction, the dozens of clashing styles and rhythms all morphed together into mastery. His weapons turned into limbs and instinct pulled at his strings. On days like those no sword in Winterfell could match his, not Joer, a man who had felled a dozen royalists during the rebellion and 100 ironmen in Pike, nor Hugh, a tower of a man with enough strength to toss about men around like dolls. Some days he even bested Jory or Roderick, who were among the best swords in the north since before the youth was born. The only thing he lacked was experience. On one of those days, the Lord of Runestone himself was passing through the castle, escorting his youngest son to the wall. The boy had bested Robb in the field, but the less said of how the boy fared against Snow the better. But the duel between the Lord and the bastard would be talked about in Winterfell for years to come. The man had already bested both Roderick and Lord Stark. He offered to spar against young Robb, and after his defeat, the boy quickly pointed to his brother, who the Lord offered to fight all the same, perhaps to redeem his son Waymar's honor. He wielded a long sword and shield, while Jon, who had grown near as tall as the older man at 4 and 10, fought with a greatsword in hand. The man went easy at first, then quickly realized the skill of his opponent. He fought harder and harder, until he was holding nothing back. By that time almost every soul in Winterfell had flooded the field to witness the spectacle. Royce's shield was impenetrable, and his young opponent could not find any opening, and when you least expected it, he would use it to ram forward and create space. He used his sword to help complement his defense when necessary, but otherwise he wielded it as a scorpion stinger. The slashes were impossible to predict, and they came faster than any knight's lance while somehow never leaving the old lord exposed. It was a greater mastery of the undull style than Roderick had ever seen before, one perfected over a long life of conflict and war. But young Jon kept up longer than he or anyone else was expecting. Instead of a shield, he used his greatsword to block or batter aside blows. But for most part he seemed to dance around the older man's blows, and instead of shield bashes he swung the big lump of dulled steel in an unstoppable arc to force the old lord back and create space. It was riskier than the shield, but it created far more space, and Jon's depth of skill and strength allowed him to weave the sword in ways Royce had likely never imagined possible, maneuvering it expertly to clash against his shield and sword to the woos and wahs of the hundreds watching them. Royce jabbed his sword forward faster than most men could see, but Jon was not most men. He casually sidestepped it, then swung the blade in a wide arc ahead of him while leaping back. The combination was meant to create space for the youth and made for quite the spectacle, something echoed by the crowd's squeals. Only Jon. He thought no other man would ever think of such a move, let alone have the technical skill, coordination, or plain confidence to execute it. How many hours did it take him to perfect, I wonder? It worked, and Royce wore the same stunned expression he had the entire fight. Jon continued with a small crouch and lunged the sword forward like a lance in a tilt. The Lord of Runestone blocked it with his shield, but it took every ounce of strength in his old bones not to fly backwards. The old man did not stand straight on his feet, however, and Jon pounced on the fact. He rested the great sword on his shoulder, then swung it in an effort to force the shield out of his hands. But Bronze Yohn had been fighting men since before Jon's parents were even born. He drew on that wealth of experience to find his footing, and tightened his grip on his board, and Jon's blade clanged uselessly against the shield as though it was a castle wall. Royce moved to punish the youth's overextension, but the movement was sloppy and none noticed it more than Jon, who easily danced out of the way and turned it to a counterattack. The old man still hasn't recovered from that lunge, Roderick realized and dared to hope. Momentum's still on his side. Jon seemed to also smell the blood in the water, and he launched an unbelievable flurry of blows. One even Roderick had never seen before. Devastating strikes from his great sword endlessly battered his shield, and every move in the combination flowed seamlessly into the next, allowing no room for punishment. It was both brutally efficient and completely spectacular. The screams of the crowd were so loud that Roderick was sure the younger Starks would lose their voices come the morrow. All until the old knight found the presence of mind and speed to dash out of the way of a blow rather than blocking it. Then he bashed his shield into the youth's wrist, taking the boy and everyone watching by surprise. With Jon's balance faltering, Royce struck the sword out of his hand, then held his blade to the boy's throat. A moment later, Jon raised his hands and yielded, an unfortunate but likely outcome. It looked close and Jon was fighting out of his mind. But if they were to fight 10 more times, Yohn would win 9 of those bouts. Experience made all the difference when skill and talent were evenly matched. The old lord had it in spades, while the boy had little to none. The gap between a prodigy and a master is truly remarkable. But even still, Roderick saw in Jon's eyes the same cinder he had seen when the boy was first bested by Greyjoy, and then again when he first started training with the men-at-arms. A new mountain to overcome, Roderick thought, and he couldn't be the one to help him climb it. I've nothing left to teach him. And he could not be prouder. It was a serene morning in the Wolfswood near Winterfell. Beyond the horizon cowered the morning sun, and the song of sparrow and crow breathed life into the tall pines and low fog, while the cool morning air nibbled softly at his face. But then there thundered through the mud and dried leaves a small red-headed boy on a pony, kicking up dirt and twigs in his path, while behind him his older brothers pretended to fall behind. There wasn't much pretending to do on Bran's part. He liked to climb and run, but galloping on horseback left him both nervous and nauseous. But Robb and Jon both told him that he would grow out of it, and this excursion was for his sake as much Rickon's. Arya, on the other hand, was half horse, and she was too young to pretend to lose. Rather, in an effort to show her brothers how good a horsewoman she was, she passed Rickon and blazed a trail through dirt and stone. They had not come alone. With them had come 2 guards, Tywell and Olaf, as well as their horsemaster Harwin. Nothing malicious dared wander the Wolfswood so close to Winterfell, but they had come none the less come to look after the young ones. Harwin ran ahead of the others, to make sure Arya didn't get too excited, and he ordered their horses stop and be led to a nearby pond for a quick drink. "Will we go any further?" she asked, jumping off her white horse and grabbing its lead. It was still a young mare, not a pony like Bran and Rickon rode, but nothing like Robb's stallion or the massive grey warhorse Jon had brought back from Barrowton. "I think we should head back," Bran said, trying to mask the nervousness of his tone. "I agree, brother," Jon said. "What do you think, Rickon?" Robb asked, kneeling next to the young boy with a smile. "I want a bigger pony like Arya," he said, crossing both his eyebrows and his arms. "Can I go on your horses? Please. I remember back when Robb was scared of his pony when he was your age," Jon said, laughing under his breath. Looked at it as thought it was a bear rather than a fletching. "The beast was rabid," Robb said, laughing along with him, then turned back to Harwin. "Back me up here. Did you not have her put down?" "Aye," the older man said, scratch his chin and laughing. Almost took a bite from my nephew's shoulder when he was feeding her. Meanwhile Arya came up to her brothers, her own steed forgotten. "Can I try?" she asked, gesturing at their horses, but the sight of her next to their horses was almost comical, like a tomcat and a mouse. "Maybe in the stables," Jon said with a soft smile. Her eyes lit up as they came upon the pond, and the horses bent down their necks to drink. "How far do the woods go?" Rickon asked, looking out at the endless trees stretching around them. "How big is the north?" "Too big by half," Jon responded, gazing off into the distance before turning back to them. "But beautiful, the people kind and the air clean, the sunrises and sunsets more jaw-dropping on every mountain peak. I cannot wait to see it all, and the rest of the kingdoms as well." "Planning on leaving us again soon, brother?" Robb asked, a small smile on his face, but Bran could see his uneasiness. He understood. He didn't want Jon to go on another trip either. "Not soon, but I cannot remain in Winterfell forever," Jon said, shrugging. "Why not?" Arya said, frowning. "There is too much beyond our walls. I remember White Harbor," he said. "A great monument of white stone and mortar, maybe 100 times the size of Winterfell, and still filled to bursting with people. Lord Manderly hosted Roderick and I in Castle White, and I got to train with his best knights while Roderick discussed business with the Lord. They were astonishing. They fought so differently than anyone I had ever seen. There's so many people out there to learn from. Father always said he was a jovial and generous man." Robb said, with every tale of the trip, he seemed more regretful that he had not been allowed to go. "Is it true about his size?" "I doubt even Grey could carry him. His sons are slightly smaller, but still great round men. His granddaughters are a different story, however," Jon said, nudging Robb on the shoulder. "They were very interested in stories about the heir of Winterfell, though you might need to grow a foot taller if you do not wish to paint me a liar." Robb's face turned beet red at that. That was a rather common thing between his brothers, though Bran did not understand it. "What about the Mormonts?" Arya asked. "Do the girls fight?" "Bear Island is on the other end of the north from Castle White, sister," Robb said, laughing. "But people speak highly of Daisy Mormont's swordsmanship in the north. Mayhaps Jon is planning a trip there, show the bear women his sword." It was Jon's turn to glow red and punch Robb in the arm. It was at the moment they heard a sharp hiss. Bran thought it a flying insect that had come too close to his ear, but then he saw Jon withdrawing his sword. Soon, Robb and the guards followed. He looked towards Harwin was, but the man was gone. Then he followed his sister's widened eyes as she stared at the ground, and there he was, with an arrow in his eye and his skull shattered across rocks. "Is he dead?" Bran thought, and immediately he felt something rising in his stomach. He vomited his breakfast on the ground. But when he looked up, there was terror painted across Arya and Rickon's faces, and that only made him panic even more. Those two were usually fearless. He heard another, and he almost closed his eyes to pretend nothing was wrong. But before he could, he saw the arrow flying towards Jon. He opened his mouth to scream, but his brother casually flicked his blade and cut the arrow apart in the air. That was something Ser Roderick always said when he was reprimanding them and comparing them to Jon during training. His reactions were beyond human, closer to that of a fly or a bee than a man. Often it felt like he knew what his opponents were doing before they did it. "Leave!" Jon yelled, so loud and commanding that it sent a shiver down Bran's spine. "You will find no easy prey here." Just as he finished, Bran spotted a dark shadow in the corner of his eyes, and a moment later, its arms seized Jon from behind and his brother's greatsword clattered to the ground. Two more shadows came, taking hold Robb and Olaf, while the younger children were standing frozen in fear. Tywell rushed towards Robb, and with both his hands he grabbed the assailer's arm before it could run a dagger across his brother's throat. He heard gurgling on his right, and when he turned, he saw Olaf collapsing to the ground with blood flooding out of his throat, and he instinctually averted his eyes. For a moment he worried that Jon had befallen the same fate, but when he looked to his brother, he found him facing the man who had grabbed him, having somehow broken out of his grasp. The man tried to slash his dagger, but Jon flowed out of its path, avoiding the dagger with a hair between the steel and his flesh. Then threw forth a punch that both Bran and the Shadow had barely any time to see, much less react to. There was a thud as the man collapsed to the ground. But Jon did not stop, and Bran could barely believe his movements. He sprinted over the body and jumped towards the man who had murdered Olaf and had been approaching Bran and his siblings with a short sword. The man instinctually tried to stab forward, but he was too slow, and a flying knee caught him directly in the jaw. Jon stomped his face into the dirt one more time for good measure. He turned towards Robb and Tywell, and found that they were stomping the last man on the ground. But Jon ran forwards, and with a devastating kick to the face, the man stopped struggling. At that moment his mind had accepted what had happened, and just as he was beginning to hope that it was over, more figures slunk out from behind the trees. For 5, 6, 7 of them. Their faces were ugly, broken and scarred, their hair wild and unkempt, and their clothes far too thick for spring and summer. Wildlings. Jon moved to stand between them and his family, picking up his sword as he ran, the blade now extended towards the attackers. Bran was still too terrified to think, but as long as Jon was still standing, part of him felt safe. "Stay behind me," he heard him mutter, though it seemed more directed at Robb than anyone. "I can fight too, Snow," Robb said. Bran distantly remembered when he was a few years of age, and he would watch the contests between his older brothers, and whisper and gossip was on every servant and guard's lips, wondering and arguing over which of them was better. But that was years ago. Today, no one wondered, and there was little room left to argue. "I know, Stark, but I need you two to watch my back," he said to both Tywell and Robb. Then he shifted his focus back on the attackers and yelled once more, "Let us mount our steeds and leave. There are softer folk for you to prey on." "Aye," the one in the middle said. The wildling was bald and towered over the rest, and looked to a normal man what Grey looked to horses. "But the hardier the prey, the sweeter the bounty." "Are you mad?" a man next to him said, then gestured towards the bodies on their feet. "Did I flee south with a band of cravens?" the tall wildling said with fire in his eyes. "We need their steel and their horses, you fools." At that Jon shrugged. He was as confident here facing wildlings and death as he always was. The confidence fed Robb and the guard, even stopped him and his siblings from shaking. One of the wildlings took a step forward, and soon another followed, and another. They slowly spread out trying to encircle them. But Jon did not hesitate. He never did. He rushed forward towards their leader. The man laughed and brought down his sword with a vicious slash. But even to Bran's eyes the movement was sloppy, relying on raw strength and savagery alone. It might have worked on some men, but it would take far more to meet Jon's measure. He effortlessly dashed the blade aside. Then with practiced, nigh unstoppable speed, he carved apart the man's chest near slicing him in half, then buried his steel in his exposed heart. The whole thing had happened in less than a second, faster than even the other wildlings could react. When they could, two dashed towards Jon, but he batted their blades aside and sliced their arms and chests into ribbons for their effort. He wildly swung his sword at the rest. It was dripping in blood. He was outnumbered, but in the same way a wolf would be outnumbered in a flock of sheep. "Is this worth your lives?" he yelled. "Leave." The band stopped in its tracks at that. Even Robb and the guard's eyes widened in fear. Jon took advantage of the lull to slow back away towards his family. Sword still pointed at the wildlings, eyes still darting between them. None of them seemed eager to rush ahead. A few turned to their friends with the cuts and bruises. "Mount your horses," he whispered behind him while still facing the wildlings. "Quickly, Robb. Take Rickon on your horse, Tywell. Take Bran." "But my pony," Rickon whined, but was silenced with a look from Jon. They hurried to do as Jon ordered. Opposite them, the wildlings simply watched, hands on their weapons, but none eager to try anything. Not after they had seen Jon in action. One spit on the ground at them, but Jon was atop his horse in an instant. Bran rode with the guard's arms around him and his cloak covering his head. He could smell his sweat and vomit. Ahead of him, he saw Robb and Arya's backs, but not Jon's. He turned and saw his brother galloping behind them with his sword drawn and his eyes surveying the forests. He met Bran's eyes and smiled. He tried to survey the forests with his brother, but a moment later he heard gargling behind him. Jon also emptied his breakfast onto the road and turned one side of his horse's gray fur green. Their arrival at Winterfell turned the whole castle upside down as word of the attack spread like wildfire, and the more times Bran heard it, the less accurate the tale became. His mother had come for him, then for the rest of his younger siblings. She held them as they cried and wailed and barfed and whispered comforting words into their ears. Even Robb seemed shaken by the whole ordeal, and servants would randomly burst into tears as they crossed path with Bran. That same evening, his father had ridden out with a small party. He returned sometime after Bran had gone to sleep. In the morning he informed them that the band of wildlings were dealt with and that Harwyn and Olaf's bodies were retrieved. He still saw Harwyn's skull scattered across the rocks when he closed his eyes sometimes, still saw Olaf futilely trying to hold in the blood pouring from his throat. He saw his brother tearing through the wildlings to protect them, and with no patience for people's pity nor their tall tales, he turned to his one comfort and escape from everyone in the castle, one he found upon the tall, ancient walls of his family's castle. He reached every peak and every roof, crossed rooms filled with people and others abandoned by time, drowning with voices and covered in dust, but he still couldn't shake the images from his head. But then he passed the window to his father's solar, and there was one account he cared to hear. "A great service, Jon," his father said, "but I know that look in your eyes. It is one I saw far too often during the rebellion. The man I killed, Jon said, and come to think of it, Bran had not heard or seen him since they arrived. "I didn't just kill him, I butchered him like a pig." "It was your first," his father said, sighing. "Do not regret the life you took. Yesterday you shed blood for your family, just as I did a decade before, and there is no cause more honorable." "I understand that," Jon said. "If it was a choice between Arya and that brute, then the brute will die 100 times over." "Good," his father said. Bran thought the conversation was over, but he heard no chairs shuffle nor any words of goodbye. "Jon, you've more potential for blade work than I've ever seen, not since I last sparred with Robert Baratheon. But you must understand that this is what swordsmanship is for, all of the training, the sores and the exhaustion. It is no game, no matter what any summer night will tell you. It is for war and battle, it is for the slaughter of men, and if you're lucky, you will do it in the name of a just cause." "I accept that," Jon said after a pause. "For myself and Robb and all the little ones, I will not turn my back on my blade work, not when it can keep everyone safe." There was some silence after that, and his father sighed again. "One day you will be sitting where I am now, and wonder where all the time went, when your children were still children," his father said. "You still wish to go south?" "I do, regardless of what happened yesterday," Jon said, and Bran's eyes widened outside. "He's leaving? You've given me the best life and family that any bastard could ask for, and training under the finest knight in the north, but I must find my own worth in the world. I've not the wits for a maester's chain, nor do I stand inherit any titles or land, and I doubt I'll find my match at the wall, but I wish to grow into a fighter who could down a man like the Lord Royce, and I don't believe I can do that if I stay here." "Then, I have some good news for you at least," his father said. "My lady wife. I know there has always been a tension between the two of you, but I told her of your wishes to go south, and after what you did for your siblings, she spoke to her uncle." "Her uncle?" Jon asked. "The Blackfish?" "Aye, the Knight of the Gate. Jon Arryn gave him command of the Bloody Gates near the Gates of the Moon and the Eyrie, the castle where I was fostered, a castle of knights, all masters of the Undul style, all hardened by the countless clashes with the mountain men. She wrote to him of what you did and asked him to take you for a squire, so that you might one day attain a knighthood." "Truly?" Jon asked. "The Blackfish? Thank you. Thank her. This is far more than I ever dreamed of." "You deserve nothing less," his father said. "I assume you accept?" "Yes. Thank your lady wife again for me, father," Jon said. Then Bran heard chairs shuffle. "When I ride through the gates of Winterfell again, it will be as the greatest sword of the age." "I do not care for that," his father said. "I only wish that you return alive. Bear no shame in when or how." "Damn it," she said, quickly bringing her thumb to her mouth to try and quell the bleeding. Arya! The septa yelled from across the room. The crone rose to her feet, her face wearing a familiar grimace. Who taught you such foul language? It is unbecoming of a young lady. And by the gods, girl, what is this needlework? She looked up to the hag and resigned herself to her reprimand. It was unlucky that she heard her swear, but her needlework had been especially poor today. Not like perfect Sansa, she thought bitterly, looking over to her sister and her goons. Each time she got yelled at, their smugness only grew. Idiots. Just try harder, the septa said, sighing and returning to her seat, much to the disappointment of her sister. If there was one upside to those wildlings attacking them, it was that the septa and her mother were far less eager to reprimand her. It didn't mean Arya liked the looks of pity she received, however. If anything, it ate away at her. I did nothing, she thought. Jon fought like a man possessed to protect them, and she had just stood there crying with baby Rickon. I must get stronger. Would Jon train me? Can't be true. Her thoughts suddenly shifted. The news Bran had told her this morning seemed like a terrible dream. He can't be leaving, he can't be, father won't allow it, I will not allow it. Arya threw a glance out of the small window and desperately prayed for the sun to hurry along. Sansa and Poole tried to engage in some light barbs, but she paid them even less mind than she usually did, and rushed through her embroidery as quickly as possible, until finally, mercifully, the septa let them go. She eyed Castle leaving. The girl had also told Arya that Jon had come to see her father Ser Roderick late last night. She considered catching up with her and demanding some clarification, then thought better of it. She would hear it straight from the horse's mouth. She ran to the great keep for supper, the hall already drowning in the sounds of idle chatter and the warmth of the hearth. On the high table her entire family was gathered. Even her father and mother had found time between their duties to enjoy the meal with them. The table was stacked with onions and sausages, smoked fish and roasted boar, with butter and bread to the side. Rickon eagerly stuffed his mouth. He was still half her height, but his eyes were twice as wide. Robb and Theon were mindlessly laughing about something or other. Her parents looked content, but Bran only sullenly poked at his food. Everyone was there, everyone except Jon. Did he leave without even saying goodbye? Is Jon gone? She blurted out, and everyone turned to her with furrowed brows. What are you talking about? I saw him a moment ago, Theon said. He went to talk to Roderick. So, he isn't leaving? She asked, her tone a slightly higher pitch than usual. Where would he be going? Robb said, but his comforting smile soon faded when he looked to their father. Father! Your uncle the Blackfish has offered him a squireship, their father said somberly, his face frozen and his tone stern. But even before then, your brother had been asking me to allow him south for months. He wishes learn what more he can of swordplay. As if he needs it, Robb said. You refused him, father? Surely you refused him. He is 5 and 10. Soon a man grown with incredible talent and no future in Winterfell, father said. I did not. Then may I join him? Robb asked, but Arya only turned to him in shock. Why is everyone leaving? She half expected Bran and Rickon to jump at the chance and leave her alone with Sansa. For the trip at least? You cannot afford to be gone for long as he does, her father said. Your uncle is visiting soon enough to escort him regardless. No, Arya yelled. Neither of you. Yeah, Bran said. Winterfell would be so empty without you. You cannot. Her father only shook his head, and she stomped away in a rage. Soon after her stomach churned with hunger, but she continued forward regardless. I'll just convince Jon, she thought, nodding confidently to herself and running up and down the castle for what felt like hours looking for him. He wasn't in his rooms, he wasn't in the training fields, he wasn't with the smith nor in the stables. Arya started to worry he had just left behind their backs. But soon, she did finally find him. He sat peacefully beneath a tall oak along a well-trodden path in the Godswood. Behind stretched a thicket of trunks and branches drowning in a low fog. He was mindlessly running a whetstone along his blade while the cold evening wind blew at his long hair. He looked almost identical to her father, only his hair was darker. His eyes were lighter and his face bore far less weight. She remembered how he would make her giggle and laugh since before she could even walk, the warm moments and conversations they shared their entire lives. She remembered his own smile when she cheered for him when he was young, the hours he spent teaching her the basics of archery and swordplay, and the steel in his spine when he was all that stood between her and a dozen wildlings. "You can't leave," she said, stomping her foot into the mud. "Ah," he said, turning to her a moment later. He bore a bittersweet smile, one he had very few occasions to wear, and gestured for her to come sit next to him. But she stood firm. "I was dreading telling you the most." "Liar," she said, crossing her arms and shaking her head. Part of her realized how childish it made her look. Another part of her did not care. "You were going to leave without even telling me." "Do you really think I would do that?" he asked, his smile turning genuine. "So you're going to stay?" she said, trying to suppress her smile. "I cannot." "Why not?" she said, almost screaming. "Is it mother? Is it father? Who's forcing you to leave?" "It's me, Arya," he said, frowning and shifting to kneel in front of her. "I have to leave for my own sake." "Why?" she said, tears now freely running down her face. He moved to hug her and she didn't resist, burying her face in his shoulder. She didn't know how long she cried, but when she was done, she bitterly wiped the tears from her eyes. She wasn't like Rickon. She didn't cry at the smallest, silliest thing. But when she looked up at Jon, she saw his eyes had watered as well, and suddenly felt no shame. "I have to go," he said finally. "There is nothing for me in Winterfell." "But why now?" she said pleadingly. "It's so sudden. You can just stay here, not forever, just another year or two, until you're grown up. Then you can go to the Vale and the Blackfish and—" "Life is simple, sister," he said finally. He wrapped his arm around her shoulder and gestured at the falling leaves above them, and the sea of stars behind them still. They were so beautiful tonight. "You either take the shot or you miss your chance." The frigid northern air brushed against his face and watered his eyes as he swung open the door to his rooms. It was many years into summer, but he knew he still wouldn't appreciate the weather even on the warmest days in the north. He wrapped the cloak tighter around his chest and strode out into the waking castle. The years and the wars were all catching up with him. The nights he would be not startled by some nightmare or other were far and few between, and it usually left him in no mood to return to sleep. Not 5 hours ago he'd gone out into the castle in the dead of night, bundled in enough furs to make him look like a fat bear, but it kept the cold from biting his bones, and the only things that walked with him were ghosts and memories. Neither could tell any tales of how the Blackfish was wandering the castle looking like a sheep. The nightmares were waning somewhat. He didn't know if it was the growing years since the wars or the sight of his great-nephews or both. He would watch the rascals run, play, and occasionally fall face first onto the ground. They would attempt to throw snow at each other or at him, which they often regretted but still tried every time. They would clamber and trip and play. It reminded him of what he fought for, and the weight of his house's words. And to say nothing of Robb, the boy was only 5 and 10. But he was already formidable, tall with a firm handshake and intelligent eyes. His voice could command the attention of the room and his laughter could lift the spirits of anyone who heard it. He was phenomenal with a sword and even sharper with his mind. Brynden had worried how loyal the northern lords would be to the son of a southerner if he had been as facile and feckless as Edmure. But now he had no doubt in his ability as a liege lord when he came of age. It was almost enough to make him go back home and start a family with a litter of his own, but then he would have to suffer his brother's attitude, and he was too stubborn to even consider it. Hoster had grown insufferable with age. They were never the image of brotherly companionship, but when their house was threatened, they could always bite their tongues and swallow their prides to present a unified front. There was no such necessity in peace, and their egos clashed until he finally needed to leave. The buildings, smithies, and stables sprawled out in front of him, smoke plumes rising into the pink and blue sky as the castle stirred from its slumber. Not a far cry from the castle of his youth, but, much as he hated to admit it, twice as grand and probably many times as old. On his midnight walks he'd visit the abandoned quarters and districts, littered with derelict buildings not used since before even the Undul invasions, wandered and trod by millennia of Stark children. The blackened arches, shattered stones and rotted wood still harbored a morbid life about them. Now, though, he'd break his fast and entertain the children for some time. Later he promised to overlook some training in the fields. "Good morning, Uncle," Catelyn said, a smile beaming on her face, and Brynden couldn't help but return it as he took a seat next to her. By the gods, he missed his nieces and nephew so dearly. He had only taken up the post at the Bloody Gates to be closer to Lisa, but she ended up away at the capital for years at a time. He saw Edmure every once a while at some tourney or feast or other, but Cat? He had not seen her since she was a scared young woman riding away with a babe in her arms and a cold husband at her side. "How is the Vale, sir?" Lord Stark asked, sitting on the other side of her. He was as cold and daunting as the man who defeated the Targaryen dynasty ought to be. But Brynden had also caught sight of him being warm and kind with his children and wife. He felt no end of relief to see Catelyn at least had found a happy marriage, a large family, and a comfortable place in the world. "I have not been since my youth. Are the mountain men quiet?" "They tend to cause chaos every few years," he said, diving into the plate of eggs, sausages and cheese laid out in front of him. "A raiding party will burn a hamlet or two. A merchant will go missing on the mountain roads. But eventually they're caught and quiet down until a few years later. Just as it was when I was there last," the Stark said. "Just as the wildlings do in the north." "Are the harvests fruitful at least?" Catelyn asked, turning to lighter matters. "That's more Nestor's field than mine," Brynden said. Nestor Royce, keeper of the Gates of the Moon, were met to hold different castles, but in practice, he handles all the administrative matters for Lord Arryn and I the martial business. "I remember him," Lord Stark said with a small smile. "Once, Robert tricked him into letting us into the wine cellar. Lord Arryn was so cross he had us cleaning the stables for weeks." They continued to talk about trivial matters for some time, until the Lord's plate had emptied and the maester came to whisper something in his ear. The Stark took his leave from the table and left him alone with his niece. He dearly valued the time he could spend with her, knowing all too well how little of it he'd have before he was gone. Not just from Winterfell but on to the next life as well. Their duties forced them into different kingdoms for decades at a time, leaving him to wonder if the paths he had chosen had taken him too far from those he loved. But their attention was soon drawn to the rambunctious laughter at the other end of the table where the children were sitting. A younger-looking Eddard had the young ones and the heir besides enraptured in some tale or other, and they hung on his every word and were laughing endlessly at whatever he was saying. Brynden had little time to talk to the boy, outside of the brief introduction they had, and they were supposed to be leaving together in a few days. "Is that him?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "The bastard. Spitting image of his father, is he not?" His niece said bitterly, nodding without even looking over. "Aye," he said. "If only Stark had thought before he acted, and to humiliate you further by bringing him into your home. Then perhaps my children wouldn't have survived the wildlings in the woods," she said solemnly, and he turned to her with a puzzled look. "When they were younger, you would not believe the wrath I felt when Robb told me his bastard brother was outperforming him in the yard day after day. I was so sure the bastard would take any opportunity to be done with them and have his father name him his heir, and so, I didn't believe their tales when they had come back, not even when it was from Tywell's lips, not even when I saw him cleaning the blood from his steel. It was not until I saw Harwin and Olaf being buried to think after everything. He had actually fought for them, bled for them. I was going to thank him," she continued, "to apologize for how I treated him in the past. I approached him in the fields one day, after they had finished training, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, even after everything he'd done. When I looked at him, I could only see his mother's face. And so, you wrote to me," Brynden said. "This is as much for your sake as his." "I am sorry to ask this of you, Uncle," she said. "I know your duties." "Nonsense. You could ask the world of me, Cat, and I would do my best to deliver it," Brynden said. Looking over to the boy, he was still all smiles and laughter. "Besides, he seems a fine lad, and the Vale always has place for men like him." He was still blown away every time he saw Robb fight, and the boy was barely a decade and a half of age. He had known boys that age to fight in battles and wars if the times were difficult enough. Brynden himself was only 7 and 10 during the War of the Ninepenny Kings, and his nephew seemed as capable as he was at that age. He could see everyone overlooking the field from his raised position, guards and knights, the Greyjoy, even serving women and cooks would stop and watch before continuing on with their daily duties. Most of their attention was fixed on Robb and some other boy trading blows. His opponent looked older and bigger, but the young heir was dominating him through technical skill alone. Robb is twice the swordsman Edmure was at that age. He thought, and he was not one to flatter or lie, Robb's skill would grow to exceed most of the lords in the realm. Of this, Brynden was sure. His mind and eyes wandered off, only giving the field an occasional glance, until he realized that the last match had concluded, and young Robb was now locking blades a man grown, in a match that seemed far closer than the previous, completely absorbing his attention again. The young man had a few years on Robb, something which made a world of difference at this age, when boys can randomly grow a foot taller in a matter of months, but Robb was keeping up with him far, far better than Brynden could have ever hoped. "Come on, son," Brynden whispered, the anticipation in him bubbling. "Come on." But Robb's form was collapsing, he was close to tripping over himself, and the man's attacks were still grazing him even when he blocked. He needed to come back before the man broke him. No sooner than he blinked, the man found an opening to draw his foot back, slam it with frightening speed at the younger boy's shield, sending him tumbling into the mud. "Yield," Robb said. Brynden's shoulders slumped, but regardless, Robb had still performed impressively. Were they the same age, the man would be the one on his back. "Need someone to redeem your honor, Stark?" He heard someone say below him. It was the bastard, offering his brother a hand while the two smiled. "Don't take me for some damsel, Snow," Robb said, shaking his head. "I was so close." "You were, but your footwork can still use some work," the bastard said, readying a sword and squaring up against the man who downed his brother. Much as it hurt Brynden to admit, he was better than Robb, far better. He could tell as much from the second their dull blades clashed. His footwork was drilled to perfection. His flurries were explosive and relentless, and the man's sword was never even close to hitting him. The bastard read every move seconds before his opponent did them. It was such a shocking display of skill that Brynden forgot who the boy was for a second, and could only admire his movements. They were almost foreign to his eyes, northern and harsh, but he could not deny the beauty in their brutality, nor their effectiveness. Has Robb had to live in his shadow his entire life? He looked over to Robb, but the boy seemed more content than jealous at his half-brother's performance. He looked back to the fight, if it could even be called that. It was more akin to a slaughter, regardless of the difference in age. The bastard was on a completely different level, near a completely different species. He set the pace of the fight from the start, and he had decided when and how it would end, with man landing face first into the mud. "He's far too good at an age too young," Brynden suddenly heard someone say behind him, and it was none other than Eddard Stark himself, coming to stand beside him. "I'm proud, but I only pray it does not lead him to an early grave." "Stark," Brynden said, "you do not mind him standing up your true-born heir like this? And for how many years?" The Lord shook his head and gestured back at the field. The two brothers were standing off to the side, having made room for another spar. "What sidestep?" Robb asked, scratching his head. "When he tried that crouching lunge," the bastard said, gesturing with hands. "Bah, I'll show you later." In truth, he's the only reason Robb is half as good as he is, the Lord said, leaving Brynden a little stunned. "A bastard is a better brother than I. They're both my blood, and I love them more than anything, so I must have your word, sire, on your honor as a Tully and on your honor as a knight, that you will keep him safe. You forget that I raised your wife, my lord. No harm will come to your boy, Stark," Brynden said offhandedly, a little offended that he would assume him a careless guardian, regardless of the history between the boy and his niece. "You grew up in the Vale, my lord. You know it is far from a cruel or dangerous place. I know Sir and John can take care of himself, but despite that, I must ask for your word, sire. Promise me you'll keep him safe." "Then my word you will have, Stark," he said. Cat had told him the Lord loved his baseborn son, But Brynden did not expect him to humble himself for the boy's sake. A request like that from a Lord Paramount was not something someone could say no to. "I'll protect him as best I can." It had been another restless night when he decided to bundle up and wander the dead halls of Winterfell, a few hours from when the castle would spring to life with the rising sun. It was on that night that he heard a voice behind him, one he had heard on the fields and the dinner table since he'd arrived. "Ser Brynden?" the bastard asked from behind him, and the knight turned and froze. "What's with all the furs?" The old knight wasn't entirely sure how to respond. He was never one to worry for his reputation, but he would rather his aversion to the cold not become common gossip. "What are you doing up at this hour?" Brynden asked, deciding to deflect. "I couldn't sleep much," he said, bringing up a hand to clear his eyes. He recognized the look, the restlessness. The boy was far too young for it. "Is it those wildlings?" Brynden asked, his too many layers forgotten. "The men you killed? Do they come to haunt you?" "It was only one man," the boy said, but nodded. "Father says that it's nothing to be ashamed of, that Arthur Dane still comes to him on some nights." "Your father has the right of it," Brynden said. "At my age the faces all blend together, but the stench of death never leaves you." "Is that why you're up, sir?" he asked. "Aye," Brynden said, then turned begrudgingly, though the youth ran to walk alongside him. "And it's why I must thank you, me and my niece. The only thing that keeps that stench at bay is the warmth of family. And you were ready to bleed to protect them. You're a finer brother than I was." "Why do you say that, sir?" the boy asked, his tone inquisitive. Tully family disputes were unlikely to reach his ears in Winterfell. "Are you and Lord Hoster on bad terms?" "If we weren't, I would still be in Riverrun holding a different moniker," Brynden said. For a moment, his eyes gazed off as he was lost in would-haves and could-haves, before snapping back to reality. "Don't grow bitter or petty, Snow. It's never worth it." The boy nodded, then turned back to him, seemingly trying to piece his words together. "Say, Ser Brynden," the boy said after a pause. "Your family, you don't get to see them often, do you?" "Far less than I'd like," the knight said, shaking his head. "This is the first time I've seen Cat in a decade and a half." I won't get to see much of them either in the years to come, will I?" the boy asked, somehow looking even more sullen. "You won't, lad," the knight said, his heart somewhat aching for the youth. "Part of you wishes you would stay home?" "I'd be a liar if I denied it," he said. "I've wanted to leave Winterfell for years, since I first bested Ser Roderick in a spar, since my opponents grew stale and stagnant, but now that it's here—" "It's a difficult thing," Brynden replied. He had never been one for words, even less so for feelings, but he had been where the boy was now, however long ago. "But you'll find a new home, people who'll make you smile and argue, and when you see Robb and the rest again, you'll talk and talk as if though no time passed at all." "I thank you for your words, sir, truly," he said. A moment later, he slowly nodded to himself, then grew more confidently. "I should go rest, but your secret is safe with me." The boy gestured at his furs and left him with a wink. Brynden couldn't help but laugh at his gall. Truth be told, it was a familiar brazenness, one that earned him his moniker as much as his enmity with his brother. On his way north, on the many days sailing from Gullstown and riding along the White Knife, he had worried that he'd hate the kid, that it would be years stuck with some bitter, hateful bastard he would have to wrangle, but it seemed to be anything but. As for Jon, he hadn't known how he would, or should, treat his new knight. Should he treat him like his father? Like Ser Roderick? Like Lady Stark? But now he knew he would just treat him like the Blackfish. They left Winterfell at the crack of dawn, so early that only Robb and his father had come to see him off, the rest of his siblings soundly asleep, but he had already had his teary goodbyes with them the night before. His father gave him a small bag of gold and bade him to obey his new knight and honor his family. Then he hugged him and told him he was proud of him. "Not proud enough to make me a Stark." The thought came unbidden to his mind, and he bitterly shoved it away. When he was younger, he thought that surely if he became proficient enough with the sword, Surely if he was the best fighter in the yard day after day, his father would grant him legitimacy, fully accept him into his house, but it seemed the taint of bastardy was not so easily cleansed. Robb hugged him as well, they exchanged light jokes as they always had, and part of his broke knowing it would the last time he would see him in years. "Show those Vale men what you're worth. Make a knight of yourself, brother," were the last words he told him. The sight of them waving him off as he rode behind the Blackfish was one that he would never forget. The next few weeks on the road with the Blackfish had passed by in a heartbeat. It was not the first time he had left Winterfell. He had made many trips across the north accompanying Ser Roderick on whatever task his father had assigned him. He had grown used to the forests and the tundras, to the mountain peaks on the horizons and wet trees, the low fog of the mornings and the moonlight evenings spent admiring the moon and stars. It didn't make the trip any less boring or painful, however. He had not been eager to revisit the endless hours spent on horseback and the sore-ridden sleep on the grass. Their pace, however, was meandering enough that Jon's instruction in the undull method of fighting could begin, something he had been looking forward to from the moment he saw the Blackfish riding through the gates of Winterfell. He had some familiarity with it from sparring with the Royces when they were traveling to the Wall, and from his few trips to White Harbor. There seemed to be a greater focus on defense and technique, lacking much the direct brutality he'd been taught by Roderick his entire life. He would have thought the practice inferior had he not crossed blades with the Bronze Royce a year ago, and the Blackfish now. The Tully's sword hand lived up to his legend. The man was so good it was nigh unbelievable, and nary a spar did Jon manage to win. "Lower the sword and cross it," the older man said, standing opposite him, steel in hand. "It's too dangerous to swing overhead, even with your speed." For all the difference between the two styles, they still shared much of the same fundamentals and polishes. Brynden only helped him better master what he already knew and to integrate the few techniques that were completely foreign to him. With some time, it should morph into something that boasted the strengths of both styles. The older knight's company was also rather pleasant. He wasn't much of a talker, but that suited Jon just fine. Most days they rode in comfortable silence. Some days the Blackfish regaled him with tales of his youth, of teenage adventures and war stories. Some days Jon told him stories of his nieces and nephews. And then Sansa, she has maybe 5 or maybe 6 name days. She goes up to Alice Karstark and tells her Robb wants to marry her, and the girl goes and tells her father. Jon said as the man riding beside him tried to contain his laughter. "Now father's confused by the ordeal. Arya's crying because she doesn't want Robb to leave us, and Robb tries to convince me to help him fight her brothers." Why would he have to fight her brothers? I don't think he understood how marriage worked. I didn't either, I just agreed, Jon said, shrugging with a smile on his face. He had so many memories back in Winterfell. It was all he'd known, and he was leaving them all behind. It was going to happen sooner or later. I had no place there, not truly, he thought. At least it's a fortress of knights I get to go to. I wonder where Arya and Bran and the rest will end up. It may not be in the next month or the next year or even the next decade, but sooner or later all of them save Robb would leave, perhaps even riding on the same roads Jon was taking now, with all the same sights and smells. The thought of it cheered him somewhat. "Look ahead," Brynden said, pointing somewhere at the hill above them. Jon squirmed his eyes and made out a few of large buildings and a stable. "An inn, which means a real mattress and warm food." Jon stretched his back at the thought. They'd avoided every castle on their way, both major and minor. Brynden worried their would-be hosts would keep them too long, and the north being as sparsely populated as it was meant they were hard-pressed to find any villages or taverns to buy fresh food from or spend the night in. They still had some daylight, but realistically the most they could have squeezed was an hour or two of riding before they had to make camp. Better to end the day early, restock their supplies and allow themselves and their horses the chance to rest. Once they arrived, they roughly navigated their horses to where the stables were and gave the leads into the hands of a bored stable hand. The Blackfish flicked the boy a copper while Jon headed for the door. The hall of the inn was large and spacious. Scattered across it were plenty of men and a few women sitting over tables and engaged in various states of discussion too low for him to hear. They ignored his entrance for the most part, and in the center of it all roared a great hearth that warmed the room. He walked to the bar, which was mostly empty, with one man who had fallen asleep in one of the chairs off the side. There was a woman behind the bar who gave him a soft smile. "2 plates of your best food," if it please you, John said, sliding into one of the chairs. I need to wash the taste of jerky and moldy bread from my mouth. 2, she asked. The others for me, Brinden said, taking a seat next to him. Sir Knight, I apologize, I didn't, she said, recognizing his sword and armor, but Brinden just waved her off, and she relaxed and leaned against the bar. The meal tonight is venison stew. My husband caught quite a big deer nearby. He stuffed the head and is selling it for a silver if you're interested. And if you stick around for a couple days, we'll have venison jerky, which I can assure you tastes much better than normal jerky. I don't know if I can trust jerky again, John said, but it'll be 2 servings of venison then, some fresh bread and butter if you have it, and 2 cups of ale. The woman nodded and disappeared behind a door. Brinden turned to John, his voice mixing with the din and chatter of the room around them. Your father lets you drink at your pleasure? He asked. How old are you? 6 and 10, John said, then shook his head, feeling guilty. That was a lie. I turned 5 and 10 last month. Starks are too honest. It'll make my job easier at least, Brinden said, smiling. I'll let you have a cup tonight, but no more without permission. I'll have no drunkards in my care. John nodded as the woman re-emerged from the door with 2 big plates in one hand and a pair of mugs in the other. She set them on the bar in front of them and the 2 dug in. He was never a fan of venison, but the taste of warm food was enough for him to declare it his new favorite. How much is a room? Brinden asked. 2 beds. A silver a night, 5 coppers for each meal, she said, leaning forward. Brinden paused his eating and fished in his purse, then slid the woman a few silver stars. Will we stay a couple nights? Give us a chance to rest? John asked. I'm rested, Brinden said dryly. In truth, John was looking forward for the rest more than him. Arya and Robb rather enjoyed horse riding. John considered it a necessary burden. We'll leave at dawn. Prepare us a bag of foodstuffs for the road and some apples and oats for the horses. Of course, sir. Let me get your change, the woman said, but he waved her a refusal. Keep it, Brinden said. In exchange for some news of the road south? Any bandits or animals to look out for? Lady Dustin keeps the roads clean of any mischief, she said, leaning forward on her shoulder on the bar. Banditry's been non-existent, and the Crannogman VE always kept the wildlife in check. Are they in the habit of attacking travelers? They're friendlier than you make them out to be in the south, she said. Helped keep the inn safe during the war with the Greyjoys. The conversation faltered until someone called the woman to bring more ale, and she yelled back before disappearing and reappearing again, a tray of mugs in hand. The 2 of them meanwhile continued the rest of the meal in comfortable silence born from weeks of companionship on the road. The bar woman would come and go throughout the evening, exchanging the occasional word with the 2 before being called away. High in the halls of the kings who are gone, Jenny would dance with her ghosts. John had heard his sister sing songs of true love and gallantry before. Her voice was lovely, but it didn't compare to the one that now emanated through the hall. Conversation around the room dimmed as heads turned to the source of the singing, a tall, lean man with a lute in hand and a smile on his face. The lute was a pitiful weapon in most situations, but this man commanded the room with it better than he could have with any sword or spear, taking them through the highs and lows of the song, before ending to the applause of everyone in the room. Even the Blackfish clapped his hands once or twice with a reminiscing look on his face. The man bowed and turned to his seat, sitting down and throwing an arm around a smiling woman. Someone should have told Theon to take up singing. I haven't heard that song since, well, since the prince unveiled it at Harrenhal. They say it brought your Aunt Lyanna to tears. Father never talked about her, John said, feeling some grief for the family he would never know, the family that was taken away during the rebellion. But she was why Father denied me permission to leave for the south for so long, why he's turned down fosterships for all my siblings. When he fostered in the Vale, he hardly got to spend time with her, not truly, not until she was dead. He didn't wish for us to endure the same. Times are different, your father's best friend sits the Iron Throne. But mayhaps he has some sense, I could not have predicted a single war that I fought in, even when it seemed as though we were on the dawn of a century of peace. Something or someone would come along and plunge us into conflict. And all any of us can do is fight, Jon said contemplatively, running his finger around the rim of his cup, before looking back at the blackfish. I'll keep them safe. I won't let what happened to my aunt and uncle happen to them. Your father must have thought the same while he was in the Vale. Your uncle Brandon as well when he charged the Red Keep, and your grandfather when he answered the king's summons to King's Landing, Brynden said, meeting Jon's eye as a frown crossed his face. Protecting those you love is harder than you make it out to be. It takes more than sword work to survive, and much more than that to keep anyone safe. Suddenly the door to the inn burst open as 4 armored men walked in. Between them a chained and bruised man huddled. The bar lady who had been ferrying drinks dropped the tray onto the floor, soaking it with beer, and rushed to the man's side. "Duncan," she cried, "what's the meaning of this?" "Your husband was caught poaching on Lady Dustin's lands," the man at their head said. He was tall and blond, with a strong jaw, long hair, and a short beard, his right eye scarred and missing. Must be hard to fight with half the vision. He was given the choice between losing his hands or joining the watch. He decided on the watch. "You've this last night together before we escort him to the wall at dawn." He gestured at the other armored men. They left the sobbing couple alone and moved to the corner of the room and sat around a table, one the previous occupants hastily abandoned. The men started to chat and laugh and joke as though they weren't inconsolable, weeping not 20 feet from them, as though not everyone in the hall was looked upon them with reverence and fear. Almost everyone. Jon only glared with disdain and disgust. The blonde leader noticed him and matched his scowl, but it would far more than that to scare Jon off. Eventually the man grew bored of glaring. He spat in Jon's direction and went back to conversing with the other men. Jon looked back at the barmaid who had been so kind and jovial to them, wailing, while his husband could only hold her and shake in place, whispering something in her ear, sweet assurances and lies that did nothing to calm her. The sight of it broke his heart. "Poor bugger," Brynden said. "The choice between being a burden on your wife and abandoning her forever, I wouldn't wish it on anyone." "We have to do something, right?" Jon asked, though the knight only gave him a raised eyebrow. "Do what?" "These are not our lands, Snow," he said, taking a gulp of his cup. "There's nothing we can do." "They're my father's lands," Jon said, "and he's never punished poachers like this." "2 hands? For poaching? You'd think he murdered someone." "Neither have I nor my brother. But these are not your fatherlands, they're Lady Dustin's," Brynden said, shrugging. "Now drop it." "But sir." "I said drop it," he said, then looked back to the sobbing couple. "I think it's time we turned in for the night. Come, we've an early start and a long day tomorrow." Sleep didn't come easy. He should be thankful for the bed, even if it was far harder than his mattress in Winterfell, seeing as it was stuffed with straw instead of feathers, but it was still much more comfortable than the hard ground he'd grown used to sleeping on. Maybe it was that, combined with the burning guilt he still felt, that left him twisting and turning for hours on end, until he finally sat up with the blackfish sound asleep on his own bed a few feet from him, and made his way to his saddlebags, digging inside for some oats. He'd go and feed Grey. The girl must be scared. She must have grown as used to sleeping and waking up around him as he had her, and maybe a quick feeding would do them both some good, maybe even feed the blackfish's horse as well. He gently passed through the door and hurried along hallways and down the stairs to make it to the inn's hall. It was dead quiet, a stark contrast from how it was a few hours ago. The hearth, which once billowed with a great fire, was now reduced to ashes and embers. The room was completely empty save for Lady Dustin's men, who were scattered about, sleeping on the tables and chairs. There was one figure still awake, the scarred, one-eyed leader from earlier, who was sitting on a chair staring mindlessly into the embers, only looking up when he heard Jon moving down the stairs. "Boy," he said, almost spitting the word out, "you're up late." "I could say the same for you, sir," Jon said, slowly walking to stand opposite him near the dying hearth. "Guilty conscience keeping you up?" "Conscience? What conscience?" the man said with a cruel laugh. "I don't sleep, boy. Conscience has nothing to do with it." You've no remorse at all? Shouldn't the punishment fit the crime, sir? Jon asked, crossing his arms. Who in the hells doesn't sleep? You would happily take a man's hands, a man's being for a single deer? He is losing no hands, he's going to the wall, and he's getting it easy, probably balls deep in that bitch before his prick freezes off at the wall. Mayhaps when he's gone and the lady begins to sell herself to keep her stomach full, I'll stop by and fuck her brains out, he said, though Jon's face contorted in disgust. He was used to vulgarity, but even Theon at his crassest sounded less filthy. Tisk, TSK. There's that look again. You better wash it off your face, boy, before I smack it off. I'd love to see you try, Jon said confidently. He feared a great many things, but crossing blades with this man was not one of them. Boldness like that won't serve a hedge knight, the blond man said, spitting in the ashes of the hearth. You've not the pedigree for this arrogance, you low-born miscreant. You'd be surprised, Jon said. The man was growing increasing aggressive, but oddly, that made Jon calmer. There's nothing I can do to reduce his sentence? Ask me one more time and you're going to the wall with him, if I don't decide to chop off your head here and now. You threaten a lot, sir, yet you're still glued to your seat, Jon said, looking down at the man from where he was standing. Ramblings and insults seemed to be the only things the man was comfortable with. Jon looked around to the rest of his men, all of whom were still sound asleep. What does that make you, boy? Scrapping your knees for the freedom of some common-born criminal. All talk and no action, he said, then brought his hand to his chin. Come to think of it, it was the late Brandon Stark who once told me there's two kinds of men in the world, dogs who bark and men who act. He wasn't wrong, Jon said, crouching to look into the last dying ember, now extinguished. It was his uncle who had ridden to King's Landing and his father who started a rebellion, while countless stood by and watched their king commit crime after crime in the eyes of gods and men. And it is I who stands now, the fate of an innocent man in my hands, he thought, noting the Dustin man's blind spot on his right. I can't pretend I have no choice when one is staring me in the face. But you, sir, are a poor judge of character. The next morning, Jon stood half asleep in the stables, leaning against a post until the blackfish suddenly swung into view. Jon, he asked, you're up early. Couldn't sleep much, he said, not wholly lying. I don't know how to, so let me not lie. The tavern lady left us this bag. The blackfish opened it and saw it filled with smoked fish, salted pork, and countless apples and oats. He nodded approvingly and threw it on the back of his horse. Surprised she found the time with her husband and all, Brynden said, jumping atop his horse and gesturing for Jon to do the same. I didn't see him, nor any of Lady Dustin's men. They could have at least given the two a few days together. Cruel men, sir, Jon said, jumping on his horse and trotting to catch up with the blackfish. I've a question. Is it about the men? Partially, Jon said. His life at Winterfell had been fairly sheltered, and now the wildings and the scarred man were the only things on his mind. I feel as though there's many cruel men. There are, the blackfish said. Once you've lived as long me, that much becomes clear. But some laws protect them, like Lady Dustin's men, or even the Mad King, Jon said. Aye, Brynden said. Some men accept it, some men challenge it. Which kind are you? The one who's never had to find out, he said. Jon looked at him as he leaned back in his saddle and brushed his beard, the boundless blue sky and northern tundra stretching out behind him. Every war I fought for my house, for my blood. Any man would do the same, and there is justice in that, but a war against cruelty, against tyranny, against savagery for the sake of compassion? That is not a mantle I've ever borne. They rode off in silence while Jon thought over the man's words 100 times over, and his father's words before him. It is for war and battle, the slaughter of men, and if you're lucky, you will do it in the name of a just cause. What cause will that be? How will I know? A few days later, a man would stumble upon Lady Dustin's men in the tavern stables. They were bound and gagged and frothing with rage, their horses, their prisoner and his wife never to be seen in the north again. Halt! "What is your business?" a man ahead of them asked. He was flanked by many others, all of whom were armed and armored, and stood at the foot of the great tower overhead, blocking the path forward. "There's little work in the north. My squire and I are headed south for greener pastures," the Blackfish said, his head covered by a hood. John the same. Ahead of them was the largest bridge he'd ever seen. It looked more like a castle than any bridge he'd ever seen before, its majesty only matched by the width of the river and the speed of the surging waters underneath, with two of thick, broad towers that seemed to reach the heavens on either bank. He could spot dozens of people going about their business surrounding them. The landscape around them was more desolate, however, gray and muddy with none of the vistas he was used to back home and none of the greenery he had been promised. They didn't need to cross it to arrive at the bloody gates, but Brynden had wished to take a scenic route through his home kingdom, having not seen it in many years, so he had been hoping for a quick crossing of the bridge. "A hedge knight, aye?" the guard asked. "We're hiring swords. 1 dragon a month as a retainer fee, more for any bounties or jobs you do." "A generous offer, my lord," Brynden replied, "but I'm afraid I must refuse it." "Your loss," the man said, shrugging, then opening his palm. 1 dragon per head to cross." "That's highway robbery," the Blackfish objected, glaring down the man. But the man remained aloof and calm, which only served to grate the knight more. "If you don't like it, take another bridge." The man turned his head both sides of the river as if looking for something. "But I don't see another one." "Spare me the performance, mummer," the Blackfish said, reaching for his purse and fishing for coins. But then someone from the castle approached, a tall, lanky man who looked to be better dressed than most, but his clothes were old and parts of them torn, like they had been worn by a dozen men before him. His face was narrow and locked in a constant sneer. "What's the meaning of this?" he asked, and something about his demeanor rubbed John the wrong way. It reminded him of the septa in Winterfell. But then the man caught the Blackfish's eye and a slimy smile slid across his face. "You fools! This is none other than our good lord's brother, the great Blackfish." Brynden's demeanor, in contrast, grew miserable and exhausted, more than he'd ever seen him. With his head buried in his hands, he groaned something under his breath. The men who had been standing in their way faded into the background, looking rather embarrassed. "You weren't trying to cross without sampling our generosity, surely?" the man said. "You wouldn't insult us so?" "I'm in a hurry, Lothar," Brynden said in a tone as dry as gravel. "And I insist. Take their horses away and follow me," he said, promptly turning and walked away. While several armed guards approached them, the Blackfish paused for a second, before huffing and jumping off, then waving at John to do the same. Soon after, men came and took their horses, and they entered one of the 2 great towers on foot, following behind the oily man, who was going on and on about something or another. They ascended great staircases of cut stone and marble, past many young men and women, both nobles and servants, who skirted out of their way. It was like Winterfell, but built up rather than across, and with every floor they ascended, he could see halls and corridors where people lingered and sat. By the time they reached the 10th staircase, he was out of breath. The Blackfish then grabbed his arm and pulled him aside, whispering in his ear, "Don't trust anything they tell you, don't agree to anything, but most importantly, don't rise to the old man's bait." John wasn't sure what to make of those words. The castle looked regale. The people looked well fed. He knew they were in a hurry to arrive at the gates, but what was so bad about this place that Brynden wished to avoid it so badly? "Something the matter, sir?" Lothar asked, looking back towards them, that same smile painted across his face. "Just regaling my squire with the tales of the great Fry dynasty," Brynden said, his tone kept to the same dryness. "Some other time," he said, continuing ahead for a few more floors before stopping and walking over to a pair of great oak doors that looked twice as tall as any average man, with guards posted out front. "Will you wait a minute for me to introduce you?" "I simply cannot wait to see your sire again," the Blackfish said, pushing through the door to the Frey's Panic, who quickly rushed behind, leaving John confused, but he followed the two in nonetheless. Through the doors was a hall that was as big as the one in Winterfell, but much more crammed, with dozens of tables strewn around the hall, loaded with food and people. All of their eyes were glued to the blackfish, and by extension, him, servants and maids milled around them, carrying enormous plates to keep the mass of people fed. But Brinden ignored them and their gazes, approaching the tables that towered above the rest on the dais. On it sat a man that made Maester Lewin look spry. His skin was leathery and sagging, it clung to his skull with little flesh or fat underneath to support it. He was so withered that Jon was amazed when he moved. To his right was a girl that looked young enough to be Jon's sister, looking rather bored and dead on the inside, even with their entrance. The late Lord Walder Frey. "Ser Tully, what an honor," the Lord said, his voice even more unpleasant than his looks, and his words felt hollow, almost mocking. Jon had never felt so vulnerable, even when facing down a dozen wildlings. He stood his ground in either case, but he was more comfortable with a sword in his hand than with a stoic look on his face. The Frey who had escorted them hurried up and whispered something in his ear. "Lord Frey, looking younger than ever," Brinden said, keeping the same dry tone he had kept since they arrived at the bridge. "That a new wife?" "The last one died, the plague got her, or that might have been the one before her," the Lord Frey said, then threw his arm around the young girl next to him and leaned in to lay a kiss on her cheek, making her face contort and her body shiver, before he released her and turned back to them. "My grandson tells me you wish to cross without even a simple greeting. Is the Blackfish too high and mighty for his loyal vassals' paltry halls?" "You're my brother's vassals, not mine," he said, not at all bothered by the man's words. He seemed familiar with this song and dance. "But you have my greetings nonetheless. Still not willing to marry one of my daughters? I'll let you have your pick," the ancient lord said. He turned towards the man who escorted them in. "Lother, where's the pretty one? The one with her mother's bosom." The man next to him pointed to a figure in the crowd. She was comely, but she also looked like she would rather be anywhere but here. Brinden didn't even turn his gaze to her. How does he manage so many half-siblings and uncles and aunts? Jon had always thought his family was large, but it was nothing compared to the Frey Lord's brood. "Spare me the daughters, Frey. I must to be in the Vale for Lord Aaron's return. I would offer you a squire to accompany you, but it seems you've stumped me once again," the Lord said. He turned his sneer to Jon, who wrinkled his nose in response, but the man turned back to the knight. "Are my sons and grandsons not worthy?" "Your words, my lord," Brinden said, igniting whispers and gasps from around the hall. "But I would stop seeing everything as a personal slight. I've turned down dozens of offers before." The man's face slipped into a glare and he turned his gaze to Jon. Part of him wished he was anywhere else. His stoic expression might have slipped, but he stood his ground. "Do you have a name, boy?" he asked. Jon Snow, my lord," he said, though the man's face sneered again. "Does he not have any other facial expressions?" "A bastard," the Lord said, almost spitting the word from his lips, but that only made Jon's blood boil. He'd sooner be a bastard of his father than this man's trueborn spawn. "The son of a rebel and a Dornish whore. A rebellion you were too cowardly to join until it was won, if I do recall," Jon said as he heard more gasps of the crowd around them. "I would have thought loyalty was made of finer stuff, my lord." "Does the bastard think himself a king?" the weasel asked, his face writhing, wrinkling, though not in anger, not truly. It was an almost deranged smile. It sent a shiver down his spine, but he still preferred the open hostility to the empty smiles. "He does have other facial expressions. To insult me in my own hall?" "Enough, Frey," the Blackfish interfered to save him, throwing his bag of coins up to the table. "There's your coppers, we're leaving." He grabbed Jon's arm and dragged him out. The guards blocked the door, but his knight pushed through them. Their hands moved to their weapons. Time stood frozen in uncertainty, but the Blackfish only glared back at Frey. The moment between them stretched and Jon tensed, ready to escape the castle with steel in hand if that's what it took. But a signal from the bag of filth on the dais relaxed the guards, and the two quickly walked out of the hall over to the stairs in silence. Once back on the ground, they made their way across the courtyard to the stables, with many servants giving them side glances. but they mounted their steeds and galloped across the bridge. No one came to stop them on the other side, so they kept their pace until the castles were out of sight. Every time I see that man, I'm sure my brother made the mistake by not revoking his titles after the war, Brynden said, leaning forward on his horse and looking back. His words are meaningless drivel. Don't let them bother you. I know that much, Jon said, crossing his arms. It's his demeanor that's grating. I wish to climb up there and punch him. I'd pay to see that, Brynden said, leaning back and laughing, but pushing his horse over the small hill ahead of them. But all he wanted was to get a rise out of you. If I didn't pull us out of there, he might have ordered you betroth one of his bastard granddaughters to repay the insult. He wouldn't. Jon looked over and followed, only for the older man to nod. He's done it before, Brynden said. Your ancestors were kings in the north. His were builders and merchants. He thinks he can raise his line to true nobility by infesting every bloodline with his seed. Insanity, Jon thought, while true nobility still eluded him, having been born a bastard and all. He still knew it took more than marriage to attain, especially underhanded and undesirable marriages the Lord Frey peddled. I apologize for letting him get to me. I've seen men twice your age fall for his barbs. Besides, you spared us a meal with him, Brynden said. The thought of enduring that did sound horrific. All is forgiven, lad. We're in the Riverlands proper now. They rose over a small hill ahead and were greeted by rolling fields of greenery and crops, so flat that he could see rivers and forests for miles ahead of them, green leaves and clear water colored red from a setting sun. In the distant rivers he saw fishing boats with men as small as ants on their decks, sailing their ships to the countless shacks and ports scattered abundantly for miles ahead of them. It made for one of the most beautiful sights he'd ever seen. Welcome to my homeland, Snow, the knight said, stopping his horse for a moment to allow him to take in the view. Over the next few days, they slowly trekked through the plains and forests of the Riverlands. The weather was much warmer, the wildlife richer, and the land much more densely populated than the north. They crossed paths with countless people on their travels, from farmers ferrying wheat to their villages to minstrels who sung and played to wandering knights with countless stories to share. There was nary a night where they couldn't get a soft bed in some town or barn and a warm meal at a tavern or at some farmer's table. Eventually they arrived at the source of the Blue Fork, one of the 3 major rivers that met at the Trident and gave the Riverlands its name. From it sprung a dozen offshoots and streams every few miles. The sight of it seemed to cheer up the Blackfish as they rode. It's like if I saw Snow again after years spent in Dorne. Some days later, they came upon Fairmarket, a larger town than he'd seen since White Harbor. It was a complete maze of log houses and small folk, working every profession from fishing and mining to smithing and crafting to whoring and begging. It sported more people than he was usually comfortable with, but he enjoyed their stay all the same. Though it was rather brief, Brynden seemed intent on arriving at the gates as soon as possible, until they drew close to Riverrun, and their pace seemed to slow to a crawl until they finally rode in view of the castle. Still, they only stopped briefly, and Brynden just laid his eyes on Riverrun for a few minutes. It was quite a magnificent castle, with a thick stone curtain housing many tall towers inside, a seat worthy of any lord paramount. Is this where Lady Stark spent her childhood? He tried to imagine her a young girl, but a slightly meaner Sansa was all he came up with. I don't imagine they would be fond of me here. Having lived his life in a castle, he sometimes failed to appreciate their splendor, especially when contrasted with the endless quilt of fields and tree tops the rest of the land sprouted. They stood as man-made mountains rising from the ground, built with sweat and blood as much as stone and mortar, home to countless generations that would dwell safely within their halls. Mayhaps I'll get my own castle someday, he thought, then looked back to the distant towers and peaks. Nothing as grand as this, but a small keep with an even smaller household. And mayhaps it is a hole in the ground that awaits me. The image of the wildling's open heart flashed in his mind again, and he shuddered. They did eventually ride away without even approaching it, and Brynden was rather cagey with any answers, so Jon left him be. Many nights later, with Riverrun a long way behind them, there played out a familiar scene of Jon drilling in the shade of a forest overhead. He pushed forward with slashes and lunges, before blocking and reversing his step. It was of the undull swordsmanship, a flurry completely new to him, and he found himself struggling with it. Hence, he tripped over his feet and fell on his back. He looked up at the canopy of green above him, waiting for some remark from the blackfish that never came. When he sat up and looked, he saw the old man's eyes were closed and he could hear a soft snoring coming from his lips. He's never going to hear the end of that, Jon thought amusingly and moved to put his sword away and throw a blanket atop the night. He thought of sleeping as well, but the sun had only set an hour or two ago, so he put another log on the fire and retrieved a staked fish to chow on. He sat staring into the fire, thinking of how far he'd come and how much longer they still had to go. He wondered briefly about what the bloody gates were like, a habit he'd developed over the course of their journey. He thought of his new mentor and all he had passed on to him in the brief time they'd spent together, and all he had yet to teach him. The fish-catching technique Brynden taught me seems suspect, however. Then he saw something moving in the corner of his eye, something unbelievably bright, and he jumped to his feet, his hand reaching for his steel. "Hello," he said to what turned out to be an extremely old woman, ancient in every sense of the word. She had an odd glow to her, and she stood at half of Jon's height, her black, filthy hair long enough to brush the ground behind her. In her bony, leathered hands was a cane she leaned on. She approached their fire and took a seat opposite Jon. "Are you lost?" he asked. She struck his arm with her cane, and it was enough to make him jump. "This is my home," she said, laughing, though it sounded different from any laugh he had heard before. Truth be told, it frightened him more than the screeching of Lord Frey or hostile glare of any wildling. There was something mystical to this old woman. The glow of her skin was evidence enough, but somehow, he felt it further in his bones. "Do you know my Jenny's song?" "Jenny?" he asked, remembering the song from the tavern in the north. "Like Jenny would dance with her ghosts." "Yes," she said, excited in a way only the old could be excited. "Sing it to me, boy, and I'll tell you my dreams. You've my word." "My voice is terrible," he objected, but she didn't care nor respond, only looking at him expectantly. He tried to recount as many words as he could to the old wraith. "High in the halls," he started, his voice raspy and low. He was fairly certain he was butchering almost all the lyrics near the end, but the old woman didn't seem to care, pushing her wizened head against her cane as she began to cry and mutter something to herself, continuing her display long after he finished. He looked at the unconscious form of the blackfish who was still snoring under his blanket and wondered if he should wake him. But before he could, the woman recovered and started to speak. "I dreamt of a griffin devouring a knight. I dreamt of a blue petal falling into a valley that was set alight. I dreamt of dragons being plucked from the sky and a blade of storms that could command the heavens above. Then hidden at the peak of the world was a king's bounty, before all of it was swallowed by a kraken adorned with gold, its eyes so dark and terrible that I awoke in terror." Of course," Jon said, wondering how to drive this woman away without being rude, but she only crackled once more. "I see a flame burning inside of you, child," she said. Her eyes were locked with his. He felt them peering into his soul. "One that cannot be extinguished. It rages like an inferno, mercilessly purging the wicked ablaze and giving warmth to the innocent. It is comforting to see. Stay the night." Her eyes finally wandered off and he felt the shivers that had been running down his spine. He exhaled deeply, and when he looked, she had nodded off to sleep, leaving him unsure of what to do. She was strange but harmless in the end, and he couldn't imagine the blackfish being too angry with him for letting her sleep here, feeling his appetite leaving him and the day's activity catching up with him. He returned the staked fish before lying down on his bedroll and trying to sleep, occasionally opening his eye to make sure the weird hag was still asleep. The next time he opened his eyes, the sun was back out, and both the blackfish and the hag had disappeared, though he found the former by the river trying to catch a few fish. "Finally awake?" Brynden asked. "I wish to let you rest, but it's nearly noon." "Where's that old woman?" Jon asked, still yawning. "Old woman?" the knight asked. "What old woman?" "Short, stout, with a cane as tall as her," Jon said, scratching his head. "She came after you slept and told me about her dreams." "There was old woman here? What would she be doing in the middle of the woods after dark? Brynden asked, before the puzzled look on his face turned to exasperation and he rolled his eyes. You almost had me. What? No, there was an old woman here. Said something about knights and dragons or something. Jon said, scratching his head and trying to remember her words. She asked me to sing for her. Now I know you're lying, Brynden said, shaking his head. Who told you of the ghost of Highheart? That woman was a ghost? Jon asked. She certainly looked the part. But she was here. You must have had a bad dream, Brynden finally decided. 'Tis the only explanation. Mayhaps, Jon said and shrugged. I'll get the horses ready. That was no dream at all, he thought, but said nothing further. Send out 3 divisions of 30 mounted men, at the command of Ser Egan, Ser Tylus, and Ser Crane, the Blackfish said, his finger running up and down the large map splayed out over the table. Surrounding it were a dozen knights, each one hanging on every word that came out of his mouth, and Jon, trying to keep up with the names and the geography. That'll be enough to scare off any number of clansmen. Ser Crane isn't available, spoke the man on the other side of the table. He was Lady Anya Waynwood's second son, Ser Donnell Waynwood. Isn't available? His wife gave birth to his heir and he went back to his hold. He'd hoped to return before you arrived. Anyone else? Brynden asked, extending his hand expectantly, and Jon quickly shuffled through the papers he carried and handed him a list of names. The older man's eyes scanned them quickly, before he shook his head and looked back to the others in the room. Why don't you lead them, Donnell? Ser Tully? You have need of me here. The worst of the work should be behind us. I can handle whatever's left. You can go scare of the mountain men and be back in time for the tourney, Brynden said, though the man still looked conflicted, but nodded. You've done an admirable job holding down the fort while I was away. But go, you look like you can use the fresh air. The man nodded confidently now, before bowing his head and making his way out of the room. Jon would miss him. The two of them had seen much of each other in the past few weeks, shadowing the Blackfish, Ser Waynwood as the Blackfish's right-hand man, and Jon as his squire. They'd arrived in the Vale a month or so ago, leaving the Riverlands, for all of its endless springs and fields behind them. That wasn't to say his new home was hard on the eyes, quite the contrary. The greenery was lighter and the sun brighter than in both the north and the Riverlands. He journeyed up to the Eyrie once, and for that day he reigned above the clouds, seeing the rolling hills and mountains for miles around him, until they fell under the horizon in the distance. An evergreen valley dotted with lakes and rivers of crystal water, surrounded by peaks that touched the sky. Jon thought, what a kingdom. It gave him some perspective on why the Northerners were as rough and blunt as they were. Scarcity had no time for politeness or mummery. An abundance of wealth, however, allowed for much more pomp. That wasn't to say the land was completely safe, however. He remembered their trip along the high road, the only path from the rest of the kingdoms into the Vale. It was the only time in their journey that Brynden insisted they take turns keeping watch at night, the threat of the mountain clans simply too pervasive. Jon still remembered the hours spent in the dark, the slowest hours of his life, begging the moon to quicken, every dull howl and shadow on the distant peaks sending shivers down his spine and tightening his grip on his hilt. But after a few days, they had arrived to where he would permanently be staying, the Bloody Gates, where the Blackfish was posted. He'd had plenty of time to acquaint himself with the residents of the castle. Brynden's journey north had left him a backlog of administrative, martial, and diplomatic duties weeks long, from food shipments to tally, patrols to organize, and a flurry of letters to respond to. This left him little time to attend his squire, even with Jon spending a few hours a day, observing the process of managing a castle. I think it's time for you to go as well, Snow. He looked out the window that dominated a large wall in the room. They were in one of the solars at one of the highest towers of the castle. He saw the sun hang a good distance above the mountains in the horizon and nodded, leaving and closing the door behind him. He had to go find Ser Roland, but there was also something else he'd been putting off, so he walked through the stone corridors and arches to a quiet corner he'd only been in once or twice, and went through one of the many doors. Snow? Baldric asked. The man was also a northern, though he wore robes and a familiar, long chain around his neck. a maester, though younger than Luwin and closer in age to his father. In front of him were 2 books he was transcribing. The gate's library was very bare, especially compared to the one in Winterfell, but the man was doing his best to fill it. To what do I owe the pleasure? Does Ser Tully have need of me? Nothing of the sort, though I come under his orders, Jon said, moving to stand opposite the maester. The Blackfish wishes for me to work through a book called Strategy and Tactics by Maester Kellen. He said no squire of his will make a fool of himself in a war council. I was hoping I could borrow it. Of course, it is quite a dense work, but few tomes give as accurate an account of warfare, the maester said, rising to his feet and moving towards the library behind him, Jon hot on his heels. Feel free to come to me if you've any questions. I've the iron link for warfare. Truly? Jon asked, looking the man up and down as he ran his hands through the shelves. He did not look the warrior, but the maester only laughed. I'll have you know I fought in the War of the 9 Penny Kings before I forged my chain, and there's more to warcraft than the swinging of swords, Baldric said, pausing and bending down to look through some of the lower shelves. Consider an army. Not every man will be equal. Some will be excellently trained and armored. Some will be farmers with spears who only train for a couple of days every year at the orders of their liege. Some have horses, others will have bows, some will have renown, others will need named men to follow. That's before considering the impact of weather or terrain, nor the food and water needed for an army. How would you condition and order every man to draw the biggest advantage? I've never given it much thought, Jon admitted, briefly wondered how his father had managed his rebellion. I took more interest in Robert dueling Rhaegar and Daemon dueling Aemond than I did the armies they led. That is much of what I studied in the Citadel, and that was much of the reason they sent me to the gates. The Blackfish knows this well enough, the maester said, finally stopping his fingers at the spine of a specific tome, before pulling it out and putting it in Jon's hands. And he's wise to pass them on to you. They will serve a promising knight like yourself well. He nodded his head after some thought. He wished to protect his family after all, and in small part to be like the Dragon Knight or the Laughing Storm, to be someone in spite his bastardy, and this seemed like another way to achieve it. I'll be sure to visit you if I've any questions then, Jon finally said, nodding his head to the man. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm in a bit of a hurry. Baldric nodded his goodbye and Jon scurried out to quickly leave the book in the rooms and go find the knight he was looking for. He descended from the castle to the many courtyards of the castle to begin his search, but still he could not find his quarry, until he found himself standing in the middle of one of the castle's many courtyards spinning his head about. Snow, said a voice from behind him. It was more feminine than the one he'd been hoping to hear. You're looking more confused than usual. Have you seen Ser Roland? He asked, ignoring her barb as he turned to her. In her hand she had the lead to a mule she was dragging along. I've turned the castle upside down looking for him. I saw him leading some shitheads out of the castle, she said. He was confused for a second before realization dawned on his face and he buried his head in hands, much to her echoing laughter. The war games were today. How long ago was this? He asked, and the girl shrugged. A few minutes ago. You can still make it, she said, then walked up and patted him on the arm. Good luck. Thank you, Maya, he said honestly, nodding to her before running off. The girl could be blunt and crass, but she ultimately had a good heart. She reminded him of Arya if she had been born an older sister rather than a younger one. Us bastards should look out for each other. She had told him when he first met her. She was Maya Stone, the daughter of his father's best friend and the king besides, and one of the few tolerable people he'd met in the Vale. He continued to the armory to fit himself in some shoddy, misfitting padded leather, then found himself a large wooden blade. He walked past the courtyards and to the gates of the castle, and soon the cobblestone roads turned to mud paths leading up one of the many tall mountains surrounding the castle, walking along a rocky mountain ridge. He took a deep breath of the clean mountain air and a brief view of the valley underneath. It had forests, tilted fields and flower paths alike. What an extraordinary kingdom! His path did eventually flatten into a field of black dirt overlooking a wide, slow-moving river. Spread across it were the 50 or so men he was looking for, split into 2 groups, though they were far younger than he was expecting. "Sir Roland," John said, walking up to the knight who was standing alone off the side. "I thought I was to train with the knights." "You haven't impressed me enough," the man said. He was tall, bald, and wore a persistent scowl on his weathered face. He gestured towards the two groups. "Go choose a team. Because I've only been learning new flourishes. The Blackfish." "I don't care what the Blackfish says," Roland said, crossing his arms decisively. "As long as you're in my charge, you will train as I wish, understood?" "Yes, sir," John said through gritted teeth, rather missing Sir Roderick in Winterfell. Roland was an unpleasant man, but this was by far the part of his day he looked forward to the most. The undull method of fighting had been perfected in the Vale, and he was slowly learning some of the flourishes and parries the Lord Royce had masterfully executed when he defeated John a year ago, and he was determined to learn as much as he could from the night when the Blackfish was busy, which happened to be much of the time. But he had been looking forward to today the most: war games and mock battles, a chance to test his mettle against the Knights of the Vale, the reason he traveled across half the continent. Only it seemed it would be the squires of the Vale he'd be facing, but at the very least, he would not be bound by the new style he was learning. "Snow!" A voice called out to him. It was Tristan, a squire a few years his senior, one John had taken a liking to. "Join us." "Are you sure, Trist?" another boy next to him said with a scowl, but Tristan waved him off and put an arm around John and led him to his side of the field, standing in front of a crowd of boys of similar ages. He handed him a red handkerchief and instructed him to tie it around his hilt. Opposite them was a sea of armored bodies with blue hanging from their wrists. "Everyone, helmets on," Sir Roland called out to them. "There's a feast waiting back in the gates for the winning team. The losing team will have a meal of rancid oil and moldy bread. Winner is the last one standing. Try to keep your strikes above the waist, and remember, this is a contest of arms. But consider this also a war, a skirmish with the mountain men. Only survival matters, understood?" "Yes, sir," a chorus of echoes responded. There was a frantic, almost fanatical mania oozing from the padded leather bodies around him, one that he slowly started to exude as well, an anticipation for a clash like he had never felt before. "We should have done this in Winterfell." "Begin," the knight said. The words had not left his lips before he heard the boys behind him break into a sprint, and he found himself running forward ahead of them into a sea of charging, screaming bodies, a battle lust he didn't know he possessed boiling in his veins. The boy in front of him had his sword lifted above his head. The posture was juvenile. He tried to swing it down, but John planted his feet and brutally slammed his wooden greatsword into his exposed sides, throwing the boy several feet into the air before he was even halfway done with the swing. No more new techniques, no more new flurries, no more holding back, he thought, sidestepping a blade and blocking another. Only instinct. A boy a couple of years younger than him tried to approach him for a duel. John easily batted aside his sword and shield, then kicked him in the chest, sending him flying into two other bodies with blue on their wrists. They tried to regain their balance, but he was upon them an instant. He struck a blade out of a pair of hands and sent it flying into the distance, then swept the feet of another, leaving the three of them lying in a pile on the ground. He felt some remorse for the child, but he had little patience for it. It was Roland who put him in the same contest as John. "Pick on someone your own size," he heard from behind him, then felt a hand on his shoulder spinning around to an angry scowl and a fist flying at his face. John slipped his head out of the way, only catching part of the punch on his helmet's cheek as he did, then flowed backwards and swung his wooden blade at the man's face. He was rather surprised to see the man bringing his sword up in time to block it. This opponent at least seemed an adult who knew how to brace his shield hand and which end of his sword to hold, but ultimately, he was still a squire who had no clue how to react to John's next 5 strikes, all of which bypassed his shield and struck him in his limbs, abdomen and finally face in less than a second. His next opponent was a shorter man. He tried to trick John with a feint, but his feint was never in range to hit him in either case. So John ignored the threat and struck back with his own blow, sending him into the mud. Another tried to shove John off his feet, but with perfect poise, he fell back into a shuffle he'd been practicing since he was 5. Then he bent his knees and exploded forward with a lunge. It slipped past the man's shield and struck him in the center of his chest, and with a quick trip he was down as well. Then he heard it. The chaos around him had muted, and there was a blow coming from behind him, aimed directly at his skull. He bent his head and ducked. He avoided having it ring his bells, but it sent his helmet flying off into the distance and caused a burning pain in his ear, one he ignored as he spun around with a vicious blow. It struck man attacking him in the shoulder. Jon moved to capitalize, but two more swords appeared to cover their comrade. He glanced around. It seemed as though they were the only ones left standing. Around them sat and stood men and boys both in a circle, nursing cuts and bruises and looking on to the fight. His remaining opponents looked rather mature, having reached their 20s but still eluded by knighthood. Their wooden swords were drawn and pointed at him. Though none looked eager to take the first move, they slowly broke from their huddle and began encircling him, something he casually allowed. "Yield," one of them yelled. "We have you surrounded." He laughed at that, resting his great sword on his shoulder as a smile formed on his face. He closed his eyes and took in a deep breath. "I've been surrounded by mediocrity my entire life," he said. "I grew up with Theon Greyjoy. This hardly new." He heard the one behind him charging him, and Jon spun and swung his sword behind him. As quick as a hare and as powerful as a bear, the man tried to block, but the force of the blow enough to break the man's guard and send him to the ground. The other two had charged him in that time. He danced out of the way of the first blow and tripped him as he passed, then stepped on the sword width of the second man. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Jon saw the terror in them, relished in it even, then slammed his hilt into his face. He heard the celebration and cheer a moment later, as well as the disappointed sighs and curses from the losing team. Soon he was swarmed by a mob of squires who hailed and applauded him. He reveled in it for a moment, but deep inside he knew. As nice as it felt, to be in the center of so much attention and praise. War games hardly mattered. Sparring with greenbloods and middling grown men meant even less. "It is for war and battle," his father's words echoed in his mind. "It is for the slaughter of men." The early morning sun shone down on a scene that was all too familiar to the courtyards of the Gates of the Moon. That of two swordsmen clashing blades amid a dozen other spars. The two had been at it for a few minutes, until one broke the other's guard with a devastating strike. A moment later, the man raised his arms to yield while his younger opponent gave him a small bow of respect. "Well fought," Jon said, feeling rather good about his victory. "It's 2-1, but we can make it a best of 5 if you wish." His opponent, Rabar Royce, shook his head, then moved to take a seat on a nearby crate and wipe the swear from his brow. His blunted sword rested against his knee and his shield fell to the ground him. "I'll concede the match, son. I'm far too tired to meet your measure again," Rabar said, reaching for a nearby jug of cool water to drink, before splashing some of it on his face. The man had been sparring with every knight and squire in the castle since the early hours of the morning. "My father was not exaggerating. You are unbelievable for your age." "You're too kind," Jon said, moving to stand next to him, somewhat taken aback that the Bronze Lord found him noteworthy enough to mention. "Were you less tired? I'm sure the match would have swung the other way." "Would haves and could have served no one, Snow. A victory is a victory," he said, waving him off, then scratched his leg. "Though, if I could give you any advice, you should work on your feints. None of them were truly convincing." Jon hadn't really seen it while fighting, but in hindsight, the knight was not wrong. He had never even flinched at Jon's many attempted feints. Good to know. And if you would take advice from a squire, you could have avoided or deflected many more blows than you did. Jon said much of the time the knight had hidden behind his shield when he could have backstepped or battered aside his blows. To do so against a relentless opponent like Jon was defeat. When he fought Brynden, the man wielded his shield as a weapon more than a barrier. You make a point, Snow," Rabar said, looking up at him. "Perhaps if I end up participating in the melee, we'll cross blades again, and you can show me your improved feints and I can show you my parries." "I'm afraid I won't be able to join you, sir," Jon said, a hint of bitterness to his voice as he crossed his arms. "The Game Master is being very prickly about requiring a knighthood to participate." "And the Blackfish has not convinced him otherwise?" "He has not even tried. Says I'm too young for it and there'll be other tournaments." He's not wrong, but I can understand your disappointment, Rober said, nodding as he looked off to another spar. Ser Hersey and Ser Hunter John guessed, from the few hours he'd spent with Baldric trying to memorize the houses of the Vale. Regardless, you should sweep the squire's tourney with a sword hand like that. I don't care to, John said honestly. I came south to fight against the best, not show up a children's contest. There are men in the squire's tourney who are years older than you, the knight said. And there are boys as young as 10 that are taking part, he said. The grown men can enjoy beating them, but I desire a real contest. Ser Roland had immediately been convinced to allow him to participate in the knight's wargames rather than the squire's, and while on the day of the squire's wargame he did take some pleasure in the admiration and envy he received from the other boys, he knew all of it hollow and false. He had no interest in dominating the weak. He wanted to be tempered by the strongest in the kingdoms, to grow into a fighter who could best the Bronze Royce and whoever else. That was what he had come south for. He would hardly find them in some squire's wargames and even less so in some squire's tourney. Well, don't tell anyone I'm the one who told you this, but after seeing you fight, perhaps it is better to ask for forgiveness than beg for permission, Rabar said, shrugging towards him. He didn't entirely understand what Rabar was implying, and still it seemed wrong to do such a thing. He didn't imagine either his father or the Blackfish approving of such an underhanded move. Besides, the game master already knows me, John thought. I can hardly go back and lie about spontaneously earning a knighthood. What about you then? John asked. How do you like your chances, Ser Royce? I'll give it my best, the knight said, standing up from his crate and stretching his back. But I am a better a rider than swordsman. If I'm to win anything, it would be the joust. But I don't believe I hold a lance to my father, or Ser Tully, or Lord Templeton, or Ser Edmund Waxley, or the Redford heir. The Vale is home to too many extraordinary jousters, and we have a dozen lords from the rest of the kingdoms participating as well. Likely skipping the melee then? John asked, and the knight nodded. Who do you have winning it? Ser Lyn Corbray, Rabar said with no hesitation, as though it was as obvious as the sky being blue and water being wet. It is no contest. No one else in the Vale comes close. Is he that good? John asked, his voice a pitch higher than when he usually spoke. He's a war hero. He took up his father's sword after he fell at the Battle of the Trident and led a charge into the royalist flank. Slew the Kingsguard Ser Lewin Martell in single combat. Rabar said, I saw him fight myself a few years ago during a tourney in King's Landing for one of the Crown Prince's name days. He eliminated Lord Tarley and Ser Garland Tyrell by his lonesome. It took a mountain of men to bring him down, and even then, he would not go down. The Kingslayer did finally best him, but on a different day, it would have been the Lannister who was left in the dirt. Would haves and could have served no one, sir, John said, but he was still taken by the pageantry of it all. A wise man told me that once. The man laughed at that, then patted John on the back. You're not so bad, young wolf. He left John standing off the side and went back to the long line of squires and knights eager to cross blades with him. Most people wished to spar the legendary Jon Royce, but if he wasn't available, they bid fight his heir, Andar Royce, and when he wasn't available, they settled for his second son. John couldn't blame them, that was what he had done as well. He's still good, nowhere near his father, but few men are. John thought, I'll be one of those men one day, if only I could compete in the melee. The occasion for tournament was to celebrate the 5th year of a long summer with no end in sight, but in truth it was also an excuse to celebrate the return of Lord Arryn to his seat in the Vale, however brief his stay would be before he would need to return to King's Landing to resume his duties as Hand of the King. Lords from across the Vale had made the trip, and many more from the Riverlands, the Reach, and even the Westerlands had come as well. It took most of them weeks on the road. It had taken the Lord Belmore of Stongsong and Lord Linderley of the Snakewoods a whole month to make the treacherous trip across the Snakewood and the Mountains of the Moon to arrive to the gates. But Lord Arryn was well loved by his vassals. I should have asked father about him. Maybe I'll write to him. He had received a few of letters from Winterfell and had sent a few back as well. Most were from Arya and Robb, a couple from his brothers and father, but not a one from Sansa or her mother. Not that he expected them. They wrote of wishes of luck and prosperity, questions of the Trident and Riverrun, of the Mountains of the Moons and the Gates. It was nice to stay in contact with them even when they were kingdoms away. Every letter Baldric gave him was cause for celebration. He liked to think his ravens to the north evoked the same delight in at least some of his half-siblings. But as far as the tournament was concerned, he spent most of his time in the training yards of the Gates of the Moon where the tournament was actually being held. The castle had flung its gates open to all. Its humble sept was drowning in wax from the hundreds of candles lit by common folk and lords and every follower of the seven in between, its septons and septas overwhelmed with countless men and women begging for their blessings. Jon wished for a heart tree to lay some of his own prayers, but none were to be found in the vale, at the very landing of the Undulls in Westeros. In the shadow of the castle, there had been erected a small city of pavilions for every noble house that attended but couldn't be given rooms in the castle proper. Luckily, the Bloody Gates were only a few minutes' ride away, so he and the Blackfish had no need for either rooms or tents. Next to the castle and the noble pavilions, there had once been an expansive meadow of green grass and black mud intersected with streams and rivers. On most days he knew children liked to run and play in the fields and water. But in the course of a month, a score of workmen and laborers had descended on it, and transformed the empty field into something that reminded him of Fairmarket more than any valley or vista he'd seen on his journey south. It held the same bustle of people and activity, except even more joyful, low-born girls and boys ran about freely under the shade of cloth drapes, freely wandering the stalls. Minstrels sang the days away and mummers and puppeteers ran shows and plays around the hour. He saw more variations of King Robert Downing Rhaegar Targaryen than he ever thought possible. One was a puppet show where both were men. One was a play where mummers dressed as stags and dragons, very poorly if he might add. One saw a King Robert smash the prince's breastplate only to find that it had been his Aunt Lyanna in the suit all along. The lords had come from all over the continent, but the merchants manning the stalls seemed to come from all over the world. They sold everything from clothes to treats to foreign arms. None of the vendors were that far from distributing random discounts either, though Jon had already spent most of the money the Blackfish had given him on buying himself and Maya exotic food and trinkets that ultimately turned out to be useless, as well a rather well-made dagger he was happy with of. That and an oversized cloak the clerk promised him he would grow into. Jon was already taller than most men, so he doubted the man's words, but it looked like the cloak the Blackfish wore some days, so he didn't mind it trailing behind him. Beyond the vendors were the tourney grounds proper, where he was headed now. There were the lists where the contest would take place. For the joust there were long rows of mud lined with picket fences, for the melee a large circular arena, and for the archery contest a small field with targets and spotted ranges. But there were also dozens of smaller lists aside for men to practice boasting horse tracks, sparring circles and small targets. "Snow," said the Blackfish, appearing behind him. "What are you wearing?" "A cloak," he responded, but the man only shook his head and laughed. He said knights around the realm are wearing it. "How much did the man charge you for it?" "A silver star." "It's a simple travel cloak. You can get the same trim for a copper or two, maybe even pence." "I knew that," Jon said, though his face went a light shade of red. "I knew all of that. I just wished to support the caravan." "Of course," Brynden said. "Now, I know your father dislikes tournaments, so I assume you've never been to one?" "No," Jon said, "but I've heard of plenty." "Well, even if you can't compete, you do still have a role to play," Brynden said. "In the joust, between tilts, I need you to hand me fresh lances." "I can do that," Jon said. It would also give him a good viewing of the joust, something he'd never seen before. "I sparred with Rabar Royce earlier. He said you're one of the favorites to win the joust." "In my younger days mayhaps," the knight said, stretching his back. "I might still have a tournament win or two in me, but my best jousting days are long behind me. Some might even call me too old." "You're too old and I'm too young," Jon said, laughing at it. "This does not seem like our tourney." But better to be too young than too old, I'd say. You've far more than a win or two in you," Brynden said. "Just give it some years." He nodded, but then someone caught his eye. Well, not the person, rather the sigil he wore, and the manner with which he carried himself. "Is that Ser Corbray?" The man was tall, thin, and with shoulder-length brown hair. His expression reminded him of the septa in Winterfell, but Jon was too starstruck to be bothered. "Yes," Brinden said in a serious tone. Why? He's a phenomenal swordsman, is he not? Jon asked. I'll go ask him for a spar. Jon, the knight said, I would ask that you don't associate with him. He's a violent, prickly man and he has a reputation among some. What kind of reputation? Jon asked, though Brinden only shook his head. I'm no gossipmonger, but there are bad rumors about him and it is better to err on the side of caution, stay away. Brinden said, then repeated when the boy looked to ready argue. Stay away. Jon's head sunk to the ground, but he nodded regardless. The conversation soon turned lighter and more jovial, until the two parted ways, with Ser Brinden needing to talk to Nestor Royce, both of whom seemed overwhelmed with the work of organizing the tournament and Jon needing to go give that merchant a piece of his mind. Unfortunately for Jon, he could not find the stand to save his life, and spent the better part of an hour running up in the stalls, past countless merchants and artisans and mummers looking for the trader in question. He ran past old men with leathery skin and glad expressions leaning against their canes and young maidens carrying the smell of lilac giggling in pairs 2s and 3s. There was the familiar smell of a forged steel in some corners and that of freshly baked bread near others. And the sound of song, laughter, and clanking cups was everywhere. But nowhere could he find the merchant he was looking for. There were also a score of knights and nobles frequenting the grounds as well. He saw knights of House Crackhall and House Stokeworth, but there were also countless Freys dotting the tourney grounds, dressed in grey and blue and sitting under banners of two twin towers connected by a bridge. And every corner he turned he saw another rat-faced man locking blunted blades with another or with a woman's arms around his neck. The tourney was only a stone's toss from the twins, and the old lord had sent every one of his sons and half his household to the gates to participate. We should go and mount an assault on that castle. Jon thought humorlessly. There must be 2 cooks and 3 old crones left to defend it. But in between his endless wandering, he came to a complete and sudden stop when he saw a suit of expensive plate. Plate armor in a tourney ground was nothing unusual. What did catch his eye was the color, a deep, dark charcoal black, with some velvet accents around it. It brought back memories of his Uncle Benjen's vivid recounting of the tourney of Harrenhal and of the Knight of the Laughing Tree. The man had humiliated the knights whose squires were ridiculing a northern lord. A man with Jon's face may have ruined his chances at competing. A mystery knight, however, the image of him returning to the game master but wearing a helmet and putting on a deep voice came to him, but it was more comical than realistic. But then he recalled being swindled at the twins and how they should have just ridden through before they were caught by the fry. Would any man stop an armored knight coming to the grounds? If so, what could they do if he just pushed past them into the melee and won? The idea felt deceitful, mischievous, and wrong, but it excited him to no end. Better ask for forgiveness than beg for permission. Excuse me, Jon said, waving the smith manning the stall over, and he was not a man that could be missed. More than 6 feet tall with arms the size of trunks with braided red hair and beard that looked more in place in the north. How much for this suit? 6 dragons, but I'll give it to you for 5. The man said, wiping his brow with a dirty cloth and crossing his arms. It's the last one I brought along from Redfort, though I can't sell it. Men worried it'll make them look villainous. Truly? Jon asked. He doubted anyone in the north would have cared for such vanity. And at the wall something like this would have been the Lord Commander's prized possession. What was it that Lord Wyman Manderley had told him once? The blackest hearts hide behind the most gallant smiles and noblest souls reside in the ugliest men, or something along those lines. Black steel's not been popular since the rebellion, sir, and the accents do not help, the smith said. But it's been almost 2 decades since the rebellion. I can take your measurements and have it fitted for you on the morrow. 5 dragons was expensive. It was more than half the wealth his father had given him when he departed the north. Wealth that was meant to last him for years. All for a suit that made him look malevolent for a scheme he might not even see through to the end. But he had not come south seeking obscurity, and he was not a man to live by the strict rules of some game master drunk on his meager authority. You've a deal. It's an honor to meet you, my lord, Jon said earnestly, inclining his head towards the older man. My father speaks very highly of you. Ned's like a son to me, the Lord Aaron said, his back straight and a soft smile on his face. I'm quite flattered that he named you after me. He did, Jon asked, trying to connect the dots in his head. He did. Don't sound so offended. I mean, he could have chosen some great knight or king, Jon said. The Lord's expression turned quite stony, before he allowed himself a small chuckle, which the Blackfish, standing beside him, shared. You've rubbed off on him, Brynden. His father would have started apologizing. The Lord said, speaking of, he did write to me about you, and attached a letter for your eyes only. The old man took the folded parchment from his pocket and gave it to him. Jon knew it was impolite to open it immediately, so he stood there until he was dismissed, the two men walking off discussing some business or other. He took the opportunity to run off to some isolated corner, which was harder said than done. The festivities were in full swing, troops enjoying songs and love-sick teenagers lounging awkwardly on the grass not 20 feet from where someone was in an argument with a merchant. Eventually, he settled on a few abandoned stalls, their owners moving on before Lord Aaron arrived and the contests began. Even still, there were people not too far from him, but this was the best he could do without leaving the grounds entirely. To Jon. I hope this letter find you well, we. That was as far as he got before the letter was snatched from his hands. At first, he thought it was Maya trying to be funny, but then two arms seized his from behind, and he saw a spindly man toying with it. He wondered who it was that had issue with him. Then he recognized the man's weasel-like features. A fry. Does the bastard think he can read? The fry asked, playing with the paper. He tried to overpower whoever was restraining him, but the man's grip was stronger than he expected. He tried again to the same result, but regardless, he refused to entertain the fray's mockeries. Spying on Ser Brynden's letters? The fry continued, still sauntering about with unbelievable smugness in front of him. You are a bastard after. Jon was growing tired of this, and he must have loosened the grip of the man restraining him somewhat, so rather than try to break his arms apart, he planted his feet and spun his hips. The motion caught the man behind him by surprise, and Jon managed to slam the man's abdomen into an abandoned table. He heard a groan of pain from behind him as his grip finally broke. Jon tried to swing around with a punch, but the man who was grappling him, one who was taller and younger than he had given him credit for, avoided it expertly, then tackled Jon to the ground, where the two rolled and wrestled about the mud like pigs to the laughter of the fry watching them. Enough! Enough! A new voice shouted, another young man, though this one seemed intent on de-escalating the situation. He pulled Jon off the other boy and put his body between them. Jon roughly recognized him. He was one of the boys who sparred with Ser Royce the other day. Leave him alone, Hardying. Redfort, said the tall boy, Hardying breathing heavily and rising to his knees. I'll be your liege lord one day. You ought to show me some respect. A lord paramount of the Vale can afford himself a better taskmaster than a fry. The new boy, Redfort said. Fry? The Hardying asked. He had short, sandy hair and deep blue eyes. A confused look crossed his face and a simmering tone to his voice, before looking back to the fry who was still holding the letter. You said you were a Tyrell. Well, Fry Tyrell. The fry boy's posture immediately shifted from arrogant, confident and cruel to terrified and embarrassed. He started slowly backing up, before quickly tearing apart the letter and running off. The three pursued, but only Hardying continued the chase. Jon stopped at the remains of the letter, trying to piece it together, while the other boy stood next to him, not knowing what to do. What a piece of shit, Maya said, suddenly appearing in her usual leather jerkins. The Redfort was shocked and blushed at her language, but Jon only gave a small smile. Sorry about the letter. It's not your fault, Jon said, standing up and dusting his knees. There's nothing you could have done. There was. She sent me to help, the other boy declared proudly. He was about Jon's age, with a head of short brown hair and an honest face. He spoke in a higher tone when he talked about Maya. She wanted to introduce us, Michael Redfort. Sorry about your letter, friend, but don't be too harsh on Hardying. He's second in line for the whole Vale after Lord Aaron's son, and he'll do anything to impress people. Then he should try harder not to make an ass of himself. Jon said. The description of the boy sounded far too similar to Theon Greyjoy for Jon to give the man any credit. It was a letter from my father. If I could always have a home visit, were the only things he could make out from the pieces of the destroyed parchment. The quiet wolf, asked Michael before nodding his head. Your father is a legend in the Vale. That was a cruel thing to do. Sorry, Jon, Maya said, walking over and resting a hand on his arm. Was that Fry after you for something, or is he just that much of cunt? Jon let the pieces of the letter fall to ground and rested his hands on his hips. I think I made an enemy of the phrase after I called the Lord Fry a craven in his hall. How did you manage that? Redfort asked, chuckling along with Maya. And he told the story, and soon one story turned to two, then 3 and 4 and 5 until they were freely wandering the disparate tourney grounds, markets and meadows, retelling stories of youthful misadventures and family escapades until noon turned to afternoon and afternoon to evening. They had wandered off the tourney grounds to a clearing, sitting around extinguishing fires and doing stupid dares like jumping in rivers and making idiots of themselves in front of strangers. At one point, Redfort bragged about being able to secure them ale. Jon liked the idea, but he'd rather not be drunk when the grounds were so infested with frays. Instead, he went to a nearby stream, tried desperately to catch some fish. You know, for someone who's a squire of the Blackfish, Michael said, grabbing loosely at the waters. I expected you to be better with fish. That's a terrible jape, Redfort. Maya said, I think it might be too dark for us to see the fish. No, Jon objected, trying the hardest in an effort to impress his new and old friends. It was always this dark when the Blackfish went fish-catching. Excuse me, said a voice from behind them, and the three turned from the river and looked up at a quite tall and regally dressed lady, favoring loose tunics and plaits to a traditional dress, holding a familiar squirming boy by the ear, the same one who was tussling with Jon earlier. Are you Ser Tully's squire? Yes. My ward brings me ill tidings, she said, squeezing his ear tighter, which only made him squirm more. And he has something he would like to say. I'm sorry for stealing and being rude, Hardying said, and the woman hit him over the back of the head. And I'll be better. As you were, she said, nodding and leaving the group of now four. Who was that? Maya asked. Lady Anya Waynwood, my prestigious foster mother, Hardying said quietly and bitterly when she was out of earshot. In truth, the boy looked far too old to be treated like that. Now listen, I want revenge over that ferret as much as you do. As much as I want revenge against you. Jon objected, climbing to his feet and looking the older boy in the eyes. I didn't think he'd tear the letter. Really? Jon asked, with much of the sarcasm he'd learned from Brynden. Why else would I snitch on myself? Hardying said, raising his arms in frustration. He wanted to give you a hard time and I agreed to help, but he played me for a fool. And what a fool you made, Jon said, but crossed his arms and sighed. Very well, what do you have in mind? I know where he sleeps after he thought he lost me. I trailed him to his family's pavilion. Quite a dank and miserable thing. No wonder he refused to show it to me earlier. Your plan is to repay treachery with yet more treachery? Redfort asked to everyone's collective annoyance. Michael, as cute as your knightly honor usually is, please let the boy talk, Maya said. No, seriously, he said, even though Jon could see his cheeks redden in the firelight. We should report him to his knight, try to mend bridges. His knight is likely another Fry, sooner to congratulate him than chastise him. Jon said he could tell Brynden, but the man's relationship with the phrase was fraught enough. Truth be told, Jon would rather sort this out himself. Are we to assault an entire pavilion of Freys to get him then? Redfort asked. They're Freys, Hardying said dismissively. For once, I agree with the blonde. I like those odds, Jon said, but before they could rush off, Maya grabbed a hold of his arm. Or we can sneak in, Maya said. We wait for most of them to fall asleep, Then we sneak in while one of us distracts the Freys that are awake. That way no one walks in on us, then we kidnap him. We're rightfully seizing him, for revenge. No kidnapping involved, Hardying said rather quickly. But then what do we do with him? Well, you know what's the worst way to wake up? John said, then inclined his head back in the direction of the river, to the smiles of 2 of his 3 companions. And I have the perfect distraction. He turned his gaze to his last, unsmiling companion, who was already frantically shaking his head. Ser Fry, I've come to inquire about one of your kinswomen. She's said to be the fairest rose of the Riverlands. Michael said as he approached the open flaps of the Fry pavilion, his co-conspirators standing around the corner and peeking their heads. John hoped the boy remembered his instructions. Never agree to anything. Don't offend anyone and don't let anything stop you from leaving. It took Maya kissing him on the cheek to coerce him into participating. So he hoped he did his job well. They were currently amid the noble pavilions, and they were surrounded by endless rows of tents and carriages. It was quite late, but not egregiously so. They had spent some time charting out the shortest and least traveled path to the stream. They hoped this would also mean the Fry was sound asleep, else this whole prank would be for nothing. They creeped around the back as quiet as mice. The pavilion was in reality a huge gray-colored and well-used tent. Almost every section was well lit, allowing them to see backlight figures scour towards the entrance where they were likely eyeing Michael like a prized goat. The single unlit section was near the back, where the 3 of them converged, whispering in low voices. This has to be it, Hardying said. How do we get inside? John unsheathed his new dagger and struck it into the cloth of the tent, before slowly slicing downward as to not make any noise while the other 2 stood nervously near him. He then slipped into the tent, placing his foot right on the side of someone's head. It seems he cut his way in near someone's bedroll. He pointed down at the sleeping man and only continued when Maya and Hardying nodded. The sleeping area was quite large. A cheap carpet quilted the floor, and on it laid almost a dozen mattresses, though not all of them full. He carefully stepped his second foot over the man's head, and then went to check every occupied mattress. It was difficult to see in the low light, but he could dismiss a few immediately. Either a woman's long hair was spread across the pillow, or the person in the bed was too tall to be their quarry or too wide. A finger suddenly tapped his shoulder. Maya was behind him, pointing off to a mattress Hardying was overlooking. He approached and closely examined it, before giving the other boy a thumbs up. This was their man. They spread to both sides of the mattress, and Hardying gently hooked his arms under his shoulders. While John positioned his arms under his knees, they gave each other a look, before they began to slowly lift. They waited for one never-ending moment, before they heard him softly snore again. Hardying began to back up to the exit they made, almost trampling the sleeping man laying across the floor before Maya slapped his arm to warn him. He had the decency to look embarrassed, before he carefully stepped over him. John was in turn dragged forward by the body connecting both of them, and planted his foot back on the sleeping man's pillow. He froze as soon as Hardying stopped, then felt the sleeping man's head roll onto his foot. He looked down, but Maya came to the rescue again, bending down and gently moving his head back to the pillow. He breathed a sigh of relief when they were outside. He looked to make sure it was the right Fry, and the 2 waited for Maya to emerge. She took a moment to inspect him as well, then chuckled silently to herself. It would have been embarrassing if we kidnapped the wrong one. We're not kidnapping anyone. Shoo! Maya ran ahead. Only one of them could see the signal to continue. The other would have their back turned. They nodded and backed up, waiting for her to scout the next corner ahead. They continued for a while, navigating the narrow alleys created by adjacent pavilions until they were at the edge of the city of tents. Ahead of them were the busy stalls, though at this time of night the activity had wound down to a crawl. "You girl!" they suddenly heard, and their eyes bulged open. But Maya thought on her feet and approached the voice calling out to her, while John and Hardying slowly shuffled away, hoping they were still unseen. "What are you doing sulking about? Are you meant to be here? You did not raise your voice at me, you low-born mongrel," she shouted. "I'll have my father carve out your eyes." "What the fuck is she doing?" Hardying whispered in a low voice, resignation painted on his face. "Milady, I simply," the man said, now sounding very cowed. "Off with you then, now," she said in a commanding tone, while John and Hardying were crouching awkwardly in the dark, having a silent argument about whether to continue or wait for her to return, which was interrupted when she did return a minute later. "We're good, hurry." She turned and ran, waving them across. They sprung into action, quickly followed her, trying to chart a dead path through the stalls. "That was some quick thinking there," Hardying whispered, the phrase snoring head resting on his chest. "Thank you," she said. "It's rather fun to be on the dealing end of the beratement." They moved more quickly. Now that their package had proven himself quite the heavy sleeper, it was more of the same, but the correct path was more critical now. Unless they wanted to risk any more busy roads, they passed plenty of fires and figures, and had a few close calls when someone would hear them and start loudly asking who was there, and they needed to quickly rush away. "Maya," John hissed, "we've passed this stall twice already." The girl ahead turned and looked at it before scratching her head. "Shit," she said. "Are you kidding me?" Hardying said, looking around. "Do we leave him here? Maybe smear the horse shit on his face for when he wakes up?" "No, we see this through to the end," John said. "Maya, you scout ahead. See if you can find the path again." She nodded and sprinted off, the awkward silence between the boys returning. "I asked around about you," Hardying said in a low voice. "Word has it you bested Rabar Royce, repeatedly in fact. Your point being?" "How about a friendly spar?" Hardying said. "If the rumors are true, then whoever wins should win the squire's tourney. I'm not participating in it, but I'll take your challenge for a spar." "Truly?" Hardying asked, his expression confused. "Why pass up an opportunity for glory and renown? The hollowest of glory and the falsest of renown." "I caught our bearings," Maya said in a low voice a second later, having come back to them. They seemed to be on the right path again, returning to the rhythm of moving, waiting, moving and waiting. It looked like they were going to make it, until John heard some very loud singing. "The bear, the bear, the maiden fair." Maya sprung back and covered the Frey's ears. Hardying started backing up. John, however, dropped the legs and ran to the source of the singing. "Hey!" John said, not knowing what to do when everyone looked at him. It seemed to be a single lute player, leading a crowd of half a dozen or so men through the song. They were drinking, playing cards and throwing the occasional coin at the man. "We're trying to sleep." "Fuck off, kid," one of the men said, and gestured for his friends to continue, but John pushed ahead. "Let me make you a bet," John said, drawing their attention again, though still unsure of the next words to come out of his mouth. "Just cover your ears and go to sleep," the man said. Exasperated, John looked back. Hardying and Maya hadn't moved much, and he didn't think even the phrase deep sleep could bear more rowdy music. "We play a game of cards. I win, you quiet down for the night," John said, shortly before remembering he didn't know how to play cards. "If you win, you get this dagger." The man looked ready to dismiss it until he laid eyes on the dagger and gestured John to approach, taking it to examine closely. "You're not really considering it," the man to his left said. "We Haveda stop the music so you can win a shitty dirk?" "It's good fucking steel," the man barked back, quieting any more complaints and tearing his eyes from it. "Do your old mate this favor. It'll only be a moment." The rest of the men groaned, but none protested further. One man, sitting opposite John's challenger, abandoned his chair for another, allowing John to take his place. His opponent looked him up and down, then leaned forward and looked him in the eye. "Are you a man of your word, little knight?" he asked. "Or will you run off and tell your father that someone stole your dagger when you lose?" John scoffed at the idea. He was originally doing this to buy Maya and Hardying some time, but now this man questioned his word. "Do not take me for a scoundrel," John said. "Good, good," he said. Everyone's eyes were on the pair and the cards the other man held. "Then I'll stick to my word. Do you know how to play fortune's flush?" "I do not," John said, shaking his head. Tough luck. Here's your hand. The man said, smiling, and started dealing out cards. John raised an eyebrow at his gall, then reached forward, grabbed his hand and holding it in place. Now it is I who must ask for some integrity, sir, John said. The rest of the men around the table were suddenly tense, looking ready to throw hands if they had to, and John did not think he could handle them all at once. But he would not be made a fool nor taken advantage of. Better take a beating on my feet than avoid one on my knees. It makes for a poor deal if both parties do not start on even ground, no? The tension in the air hung for a second. He saw eyes scanning him and trying to size him up, and in his mind he ran through 100 ways he could escape if it escalated to violence. But through it all his confident, aggressive demeanor never cracked. You certainly have balls on you, boy, an older man sitting to his right said, laughing under his breath. His hair was white and thinning and his beard reached the table, his arm moving to pull John's hand off. Very well, I'll explain the rules to you. The man he was gambling against dealt out 3 cards for each man, then took a big pile of coppers and began splitting them between himself and John, while the graybeard started reciting the rules. It's a Dornish game. Each of you will have 20 coppers. Whoever gets all 40 wins the bet. The old man said, each turn you're forced to gamble away at least 1 copper. If your opponent bets more, you're forced to match his bet, potentially losing it all if his hand is better, or fold your cards and lose whatever you've bet already. What's to stop me from betting all 20 every turn, and forcing him to lose a copper every time if he does not match? Nothing. You could, but if he matches your bet when your hand is weaker, you lose immediately. What determines the strength of a hand? The highest number, from 1 to 10. The man said, pulling a random card from the deck and showing it to John. It had a 7 written on it, as well as 7 small stags drawn on it. Stronger than that is 2 cards of the same number. 2 threes will beat 1 10. Then it's 3 numbers in a row, a 5, a 6, then a 7 for example. Then it's 3 cards with the same symbol, so 3 cards with stags, 3 roses, 3 dragons, or 3 hearts. Then it's 3 cards of the same number, those trump all, understood? John ran it over in his head one more time, a higher number, then a pair, then ascending order, then 3 matching symbols, then 3 matching numbers. Understood, John said. He took a look at his cards. The only thing he had was a 7. The other man had a dozen ways of beating him. He threw the cards aside and slid the man a copper. Fold. Good, the older man said. Every turn, if neither folds, you can discard one of your cards and draw a random one, or not, until one of your cracks. The next hand John was given had a 6, another poor hand. He considered trying to bluff the man into thinking he had a strong hand, but thought better of it, throwing aside his cards and sliding another copper. The man must now think me a conservative and safe player. John thought. His next hand he only had a 3, but instead of folding, John bet 5 more coppers, causing his opponent to fold. A game of deceit and catching deceit. In truth, John found both distasteful and thought himself bad at them, but he found himself enjoying the game far more than he thought he would, and being far better at than he expected, peering into his opponent's soul with every bet and fold he did, trying to predict what to do and what his opponent thought he would do. At one point, John was down 9 coppers to 31. Part of him accepted that he might lose, but the competitive part him, the same one that drove him to practice his sword work for thousands of hours, refused to accept defeat so easily. That was when he realized it. The man always seemed to stare him in the eyes whenever he lied, trying too hard to project strength where there was none to intimidate him. He had fallen to it a few times, but now he was using it his advantage and quickly won back any coppers he lost. 3 more, the man said, pushing forward 3 of his 7 remaining coppers. Let's make it a clean 7, I think, John said. He barely had a pair of 2s in his hand. The man paused, then bitterly folded a pair of 7s, cursing and kicking when John revealed his cards. If you lose to a boy, the man next to his opponent said, shaking his head, though his opponent only turned to him in anger. It's his fault for helping him, he objected, pointing to the older man who had taught John the game. My mother didn't raise a thief, the older man said. How old are you? Your mother was likely the conqueror's mistress, his opponent said, to the laughter of everyone on the table. Just deal the cards, my good man, John said, cutting through their yelling, rather pleased with what he had drawn. "It's all right. I've 4 more coppers, I can come back," the man said, pushing one to the middle of the table, but then John pushed 4 forward immediately, causing the man to grow an angry scowl. "You know what? Fuck you, you've bluffed me too many times." The man pushed forward all his remaining coins and revealed his 2 nines. But then John revealed 3 dragons to the groaning of the crowd as the man put his hands in his arms, though John only felt a small sense of pride. "You lost to a child," another man said. A sentiment seemed to be felt across the table. "How old are you?" 5 and 10, John said, rising to his feet. "Shut up," his opponent said over his companion's laughter. "I guess we'll keep it down." "You know what?" John said, looking over and finding Hardying and Maya were long gone. "My knight has a place in the castle. I insisted we sleep outside. We can move, you can enjoy yourselves." The men hurried as he turned to leave, but he heard a voice call him out. His opponent threw him a deck of cards wrapped in twine, not the one they were playing with, rather a spare from his bags. "You won them fair and square," he said with a smile. "What's your name?" "Jon Snow," he answered honestly, and the man nodded along. "Here's to your health," he said, raising his cup. The others joined and cheered. "If you do get that knighthood, look up the Griffin's band." John felt his lips naturally curl into a smile. He slightly inclined his head in acknowledgement, before running off. It took him a few minutes to find out where he was, then to find his way to the stream where they were meant to meet up with Redfort. It was much easier to navigate without needing to drag a body along. He found the large yellow tent, ran to the tree to the south, then from there he could see the fire in the distance and 2 figures casting a shadow over it. Maya and Hardying were whispering and laughing at something or other. They were startled at his arrival, but soon settled down. "Where the fuck did you run off to?" Maya asked. Hardying still seemed taken aback every time she swore, though John was used to it. "Made some friends," John said, then waved her away. "Where's Fry?" They pointed to the curled figure on the floor, still snoring like a babe. "You made the lady carry him," Hardying said. I spend my days pushing bison and mules. It's no big deal." "Did you do the shit smearing?" John asked. She was carrying it in her pockets," Hardying said, wrinkling his nose, and it was maybe the first time John truly sympathized with him. "And now it's all over his face and down his shirt," she said with a smile, then narrowed her eyes at the approaching figure in the distance. "Is that Redfort?" It was indeed Redfort, who arrived gasping and complaining. "He tried to make me sleep there." "Welcome the newest member of the family," he said. They quietly laughed at his suffering, but then they turned their attention to the figure of the ground. John and Hardying eyed each other. Before approaching him, Hardying grabbed his hands, while John grabbed his ankles, and they lifted him up with much less gentleness, then approached the side of the river and began swinging him back and forth, struggling to keep their expressions straight. He slept as still as a log, even as he went sailing through the air and crashing into the water. They watched for a few moments, but soon the water was disturbed as he awoke and frantically tried to find his bearings. They could see the flailing limbs and occasionally surfacing head. Eventually he found his footing and quickly peered his head over the water, only for Maya to nail him in the middle of the forehead with a leftover piece of shit and for him to fall back again, to the laughter of everyone at the riverside. John felt Hardying grab his shoulder and pull him along, following Maya and Michael, who were sprinting away. They ran after them, hearing cursing echoing behind him and the hysterical laughter ahead of him. "You're cheating," Hardying said, after having been thrown onto his back once more. He sat up and crossed his arms, the edges of his blonde hair caked in mud, only to see John and Michael laughing at him. "I'm serious, you must be cheating." "How would I cheat?" John asked, walking over and offering him a hand to help him to his feet. "Did I get some other man to wear my face to come and spar with you?" "I can get you Ser Corbray for that if you wish," Michael said from where he was sitting on a large rock to the side. "I'm to squire for him soon." "Truly?" John asked, a hint of envy in his voice. He wouldn't trade the blackfish for anyone, but he would give anything to cross blades with Corbray and see how high a ceiling someone could achieve. I might get the chance soon enough. He thought. The melee started at the end of the week, and with it, his gambit to enter under guise of Mystery Knight. I heard that there are bad rumors about him. He has a colorful personality, but none can deny his prowess, Redfort said, quick to defend his soon-to-be knight. Colorful is one way to put it, Harding said. When he's drunk, he's getting into fights over nothing. When he's not drunk, he's spending fortunes on vanities. Were he a lesser swordsman, his lord brother would have washed his hands of him. He's not the most reliable man, Michael said, raising his hands. But my father's not sending me to learn reliability from him. Are those the worst of the rumors? John asked. Violence? Drunkenness? Profligacy? I've not heard anything worse, Harding said, shrugging his shoulders, Michael doing much the same. Then what was Brynden dithering about? Enough about him, square up again, Snow. How many times must he put you in the dirt before you concede? Redfort asked. Until I down the bastard even once, Harding said, but John ignored the insult. It would only make putting him down again all the sweeter. You're never going to scratch me that footwork, John responded, happy to tighten his grip on his sword and engage the boy once more. What footwork? The man asked, suddenly stopping in place and resting his hands on his hips, much to John's disappointment. The man-at-arms at Waynwood says it's good. It's not bad, just sloppy, John said. Harding's movements were explosive and his attacks powerful, but he did not have the technical skill to support it. Most of the time John could let him trip over himself. It needs a lot of polish to contest any true knight. Sloppy, Harding said, shaking his head. I'm the most talented squire in Waynwood. Talent without work is just wasted potential, John said, shrugging. Nonsense, Harding said, squaring up again. I have you now. How about a change of pace? Redfort said, rising to his feet. How are your lances? Exemplary, Harding said with confidence, raising his chin. Mediocre, John said, though that only prompted raised eyebrows from the two. I'm not much of a horseman. Why? Harding asked. You talk of work, why not work on that then? There's more glory in the justs than the melees. And there's more to surviving a battle than handling a lance. John argued, but it seemed in this matter he was outvoted. That's still no excuse to neglect it, Redfort said. It would be a shame to pair a sword hand like that with a bad lance. Let's go do a few tilts, Harding declared, and we'll give you some advice for a change. The three walked from where they were crossing blades near the grounds. With the contest starting soon, they were surrounded by legions of knights who were vigorously training for the tournament. It made finding good practice easy. John had made the acquaintance of countless knights through spars, and found himself feeling rather confident about his up-and-coming gambit considering how he performed against them. He had expected some retaliation from the Freys after their stunt, but none came, not yet at least. He still saw them glare and glower, but no more than before. Perhaps the boy they kidnapped was too embarrassed or terrified to tell anyone. Perhaps he hadn't realized it was them. Either way, John valued the peace of mind. He had no time for distractions. The lists where the joust would actually be taking place in a few days had been taken over by Lord Simon Templeton and his knights to train. The practice lists were in the hands of Ser Crakehall and his men, and they would not be leaving for hours yet. And even the secondary and tertiary training lists were occupied by a band of Lord Arryn's knights who mindlessly dismissed them. It was so crowded that they had to get their own horses and settle for a nearby forest road that John knew. On the way they talked of swordplay, mentors, and horses. And then my father caught me and Jasper returning to the castle at 4 in the morning, and our horses were taken away for a month, Michael said. Lady Anya would have had my hide if that was me, Harding said. She can be a real cunt. That's one way to describe a foster mother. John said. He was rather fond of Donnell Waynwood, who served at the Bloody Gates as Brynden's right-hand man, and to hear such vile words about his friend's mother irked him. Michael had also given him a similar look. Jon couldn't imagine even thinking that way about Lady Stark, and she had always been harsh with him. But then again, he knew he wasn't as vulgar or as boorish as Harding. And he gets to be a trueborn heir and I'm a bastard. He thought bitterly, remembering the proclivities and nasty habits of Greyjoy as well. If Jon behaved even half as bad as they did, he'd have drawn 100 times the scorn. What taints my blood so? She deserves it, Harding said, waving him off. What about you? How's squireship under the Blackfish? He's lenient, Jon said. I'm too old for a strict guardian. I can take care of myself for the most part. I wish Anya saw it so, Harding said. You could also afford to get into fewer mishaps, Jon said. The boy had randomly started a fight with him on the word of a lying fry he just met. He must not be unfamiliar with trouble. He's not wrong, Redfort said. She expects a lot from the second in line for the entire kingdom. At least I was weaned before I could walk, Harding said. That's a nasty rumor and untrue, Redfort said, leaving Jon confused. What rumor? Jon asked. He had been in the kingdom for months, but it seemed he had missed all the gossip. The little Lord Robert Arryn still nurses from his mother, and he's a boy of 6. Harding said. Jon scowled in response. The boy was his sibling's cousin, and at that age Robb was terrorizing the training yard. Sansa was acting a proper lady. Arya was playing with swords and bows and Bran was scaling walls. Their lives in Winterfell were sheltered, and yet all of them had been tempered by age. And it's no rumor, Maya and I saw it with our own eyes. You can ask her when we see her. Lord Arryn would not allow it, Redfort said. What choice does he have when the boy is too sickly and stunted to leave his mother's side? Harding said, opening his arms. Such terrible luck he's had with his sons. It's why I say I will be Lord of the Vale one day. Not that I might be. That boy will never see his 16th name day. Keep dreaming, Harding, Redfort said, rolling his eyes. At least I'm likely to inherit something. How many healthy brothers do you have to go through to inherit the Redfort? 2? 3, Harding said. What about our bastard friend here? Will it be the wall for you, or do you intend to usurp your trueborn brother? Only one of us has ambitions of being a supplanter, and it's neither me or Redfort, Jon said, slapping him gently on the back, then looked off into the cobblestone road leading into the mass of thickets and trunks and fog ahead of them. He truly had no clue of what to do after he received his knighthood. And it won't be the wall for me either. My future is mine to grasp. Mayhaps it is a lifetime on the roads that await. Mayhaps a place at my brother's side or a holdfast so small it's not drawn on any maps. But I do not worry about it. I will be the best sword on the continent, and after that, come what may. Now you're the one dreaming, Harding said, but Jon only looked him in the eye and smirked with confidence, which only caused the other boy to scowl. The wall would be a waste of your talents and your knighthood in either case, Redfort said. If you've no options, come to Redfort. My house can use knights like you. No, no, no. The incoming invasion of ice spiders and wildlings simply need him at the wall, Harding said. Don't believe in ice spiders? Jon asked. Of course not. My sweet summer child, to deny the existence of ice spiders who clamber the wall, giants who quake the mountains with their voice and wyverns who fell armies with breaths of ice. Jon said he didn't believe any of that either, but he was hoping to get some reaction from the boy, who only dismissively rolled his eyes. Fear the children of the old gods, Harding, fear them. If the old gods and their children were so powerful, they would have stopped the Undulls, Harding declared, his mouth turning to a smug grin. But now the clansmen are all that remains of the first men, savages who live like animals in the mountains and come down to steal goats and women. Clansmen and the North, Jon said, somewhat somber. Sometimes he wished he had born in those times, given the chance to match arms with the Undulls when they invaded. Theon the Hungry Wolf had the right idea. As well as House Redfort, Royce, Blackwood, Bracken, Dane, and anyone who's married them, I imagine you've more blood from the first men than I do. We've evolved past worshipping trees at least, Harding said. You better dispel all these notions of old gods and giants if you're to become a true knight. Did the Blackfish kneel before a tree when he earned his knighthood or before the altar of the warrior? A slab of marble is what it is, Jon said. Harding looked ready to yell back, but Redfort got between the two and waved for them to stop. You two would make better maesters than knights, Michael said, a cross look on his face. We're here to practice our jousting, not debate theology, and this spot looks good enough for me. He wasn't wrong. The trees stood some ways from the cobblestone path and would allow them to hang up any targets they needed. If the day went well, they had also brought some armor to practice some tilts against each other, and the path was wide enough to allow for multiple horsemen. And look, some cut-down weirwoods, so what's left of your gods can watch you fail, Harding said, pointing to some stumps nearby. Harding! Redfort yelled at the older boy, who scoffed and mounted his horse, going to tie their targets, bags of pebbles and dirt to the branches above them. Jon looked at the stumps in question, and was pained to admit that the older boy was right. He'd been to the godswood enough times to recognize the texture and color of the bark, the size and width of the base, but most importantly the weary feeling they evoked. Even as a stump, it felt like he was standing in the presence of something greater than any king or lord or dragon. If he focused enough, everything faded away, and he could almost see the tree hole, towering over the forest and enveloping him completely under its red canopy, completely alone with no company but the piercing blood-red eyes. Jon, Redfort asked, waking him for his reverie. When he looked, the great tree was a stump again. Are you okay? Yes, I apologize, Harding was being an ass. Redfort said, waved him off. But he has a good lance, you can find worse practice partners. I won't turn down practice, even if it's from a prick, Jon said. He threw his armor from the back of his horse, then mounted Grey and slowly brushed her mane. So much of his success would depend on how well he could communicate with her. Riding is the most important skill a juicer can have, Harding said flatly. It's not just avoiding getting thrown off or knowing how to gallop. You need to be one with your horse, to control it without your hands, to give you a burst of speed or bounce up whenever you need to. I don't remember agreeing to a lecture, Michael said, jumping atop his own black steed. Let's just take turns and see how many targets we can get. Harding looked annoyed at the interruption, but conceded. Redfort went first while Jon and Harding took their horses off the road and watched. He galloped down the path, kicking up a cloud of dust behind him. Yet despite his speed, his lance found target after target. He had managed to strike all 10 of the targets Harding had placed. That boy is more competent than I give him credit for, Jon thought. And he's a fourth son? Will Rickon grow to be as strong one day? He rode back to them with a satisfied smile. Harding went next. He was slower. His lance missed a bag and scraped against another, but he managed 8 out of the 10, which left only Jon to go. He guided his horse to one side of the road, then kicked it into a trot, then a gallop. He never hesitated, not even when he did not know what he was doing. He managed his first target well enough, but Grey was too fast for the second one and too slow for the third. He missed the fourth by virtue of missing the last 2, but managed to find the 5th well enough. If Grey was cooperating, he had the coordination to strike his lance true. His skill with the blade was proof enough of that, but his horse knew little more than to gallop or trot, and he knew little of how to keep his balance on her back. In the end, he only struck 4 of the 10 targets, and braced himself for Harding. Surely your old gods could have nudged a branch or something? Leave him be, Harding. He already said he wasn't much of a juicer, Redfort said. No. I endured too much humiliation in that sparring circle to be silent now, Harding said. I'll lay you out again if you wish, Jon said. Not with a lance, you won't, Harding said, crossing his arms smugly. But we can test it. Jon huffed and jumped off his horse and brushed Grey's hair. Its equine eyes were looking off. He tried to decipher what the horse must have been thinking, how to get her to work with him, then gave an accusatory glance at Harding's own steed. Horse whispering isn't going to help, he heard Harding say, with the same conceited edge to his tone. You need discipline and technique. communicating things with a small kick or pull. It takes years in. But then his voice disappeared into the background, more akin to the bark of a distant dog or a conversation just outside his hearing, like the hum of a fly or the twittering of a bird. All he could pay attention to now was the clash. It felt greater than any war or any tilt of any joust. It wasn't real, yet it was all-consuming. It was like grinding down granite, like he was trying to crush steel in his hand. He had 4 legs now, but that was no matter. He was jumping about frantically trying to escape something. He tried to control it, but any time a region came under his sway, another escaped it. His head, now long and horse-like, was waving around in the air, his mane dancing as he tried to come under control. It was stalemate, like trying to swimming up a river or hike up an avalanche. He could hold, but there was no progress. Every time he shifted focus, what he had consumed crumbled behind him, from the legs to the mouth until he eventually found the eyes. He saw himself galloping forward. In his path a boy he would knock over. The boy was, well, wait, it was Jon. He heard suddenly as he was doused awake as if by a splash of cold water. It was Michael looking down on him. His eyes panicked and scared. His head hurt. They were in the woods and, oh, thank the 7. He heard the sound of hooves disappearing in the distance and turned to see Harding's horse galloping towards the horizon. But its rider was not in the saddle. He turned and saw the moaning figure of Harding on the ground. "What happened to him?" Jon asked. "His horse went feral and bucked him off. Then it nearly trampled you to the ground. Did you hit your head or spine?" He did have a headache, but it was from the jolt more than from a direct impact. He felt a pain in his chest and shoulder from where the horse had collided into him, but no broken ribs or ruptured lungs. He just had the air knocked out of him. He would recover in time for the melee. "Oh no, the horse has made him even more simple," Harding said. Finally sitting up, Jon could only chuckle and roll his eyes. "Eat shit, Harding," Jon said, rising to his feet and offering the boy a hand. "Are you all right?" "My pride was only thing hurt," he said, taking the hand and pulling himself up. "It was rather funny to get bucked off in the middle of a sermon about how to control a horse," Michael said. "Yes, Redfort, we got that," Harding said. "It was really funny though," Jon said, trying and failing to contain his laughter. "I can't wait to tell Maya. If she hears word of this." The 3 eventually found their way back to the tourney grounds. They looked for Harding's horse for some time, but could not find it. They settled for putting the word out with the guards and went to buy spiced nuts, pies and mead, then found a table to eat and drink and play a game of Fortune's Flush. Maya eventually joined them, having finished whatever work Miranda Royce, Nestor's daughter, had required of her, and Michael told her the story of Harding Horse, to her laughter and the other man's objections and justifications. But Jon's mind was elsewhere entirely. He only offered a comment or forced laugh from time to time, and he ended up losing quite a bit of coin gambling. But the dreamlike state he entered, the feral horse and what he saw were all he could think about. Eventually they said their good nights and split off, and Jon began the 20-minute walk towards the bloody gates, his mind still torturing itself with what happened. "Can't have been nothing," he thought. "What a coincidence it would be for Harding's horse to grow untamed while I saw myself through its eyes." It was rather late at night, but he didn't mind it. It was a full moon, making the path he was walking along rather well lit. His steel had his on his back and his newly bought dagger on his belt. He could handle anything malicious he came across. He stared up at the full moon, trying to replicate what he had done. His mind would wander and search, even as he tried to focus it back to the subject of the dream, until eventually he saw something fly over the moon. Everything disappeared again, and he was back in his dream, except this time there was no clash, no conflict. It might have happened, but it was so minor that he remembered it less like crushing steel and more like snapping a twig. He was flying through the sky, in full control of his small body and wings. He had wings now, he noticed. He flapped them eagerly, but some instinct overran him, allowing him to spread them and glide through the night sky. It felt like the entire Vale of Arryn revealed itself to him as he peered down. He saw distant rocky mountains and the verdant evergreen fields they nestled. He ascended the Giant's Lance and its 3 castles in a blink, and found himself circling the Eyrie. It stood dead and silent above the clouds, sitting regally on the highest mountain for miles, like a lost castle or city with only ghosts wandering its halls. Soon he turned and dived. He should have been afraid, but it felt like second nature. He flew to the gates of the moon and the tourney grounds surrounding. He saw the worn fry tent as well countless other pavilions of every color and house. He found the river where they had dumped the fry. Soon he even saw the rowdy knights up to their old tricks. He saw the man he had bested swearing and handing over coins to his friends. He scanned 100 faces again until he found Maya and Redfort sitting around a campfire talking, laughing and drinking the night away. He found Harding completely drunk out of his mind while a scantily dressed woman cuddled with him and whispered sweet nothings into his ear. He fluttered his wings and rose again, the trees and dirt passing under him at a frightening pace. He flew into the gates of the moon, the mighty fortress asleep at this time of night. Even the night lookouts had found slumber on their posts. At the tip of the castle the Lord Aaron was sleeping soundly while his wife was still awake looking conflicted. He then circled around and headed to the bloody gates. Many an army had been shattered trying to cross it, but he easily flew over it in this form. He even found Bryndon's solar where the knight was yet awake, but not in any work. Rather he was gently sipping wine and reading some book. The knight caught sight of him for a moment. His expression turned confused, before he threw something at him and John flew off. He saw the courtyard where he sweat and bled every day. He saw the maester's quarters and library. He even found the site of the squire's war games he dominated. He was flying back towards the tourney grounds, but on the cobblestone path connecting both castles, he spotted a young man standing still. He dove through the branches and leaves and landed on his shoulder. When he opened his eyes again, there was a large bird on his shoulder, one that felt familiar, bearing a mixture of brown and white feathers. If he'd seen it in the wild, he might guess it was a hawk. Its eyes looked at his curiously. Ha! The two mounted knights charged down the lists. Around them a crowd of hundreds and thousands drowned out the sounds of thundering hooves with deafening screaming. The onlookers were split between a tangled mass of bodies where low-born farmers, miners, maidens and septons were clambering over each other for a view of the tilt, and the spacious noble stands erected a few feet off the ground. They allowed the many visiting nobles and knights comfortable seating and a clear view of the opening day of the tournament. He saw 3 women for every man in those stands. Most were flush with anticipation, eagerly awaiting their brothers, husbands or fathers' turn on the lists. He made out Michael and his brothers and father, Harding with his foster mother and siblings. He made out Miranda and Isilla Royce. He saw the white arrows of House Hunter and the bronze spearheads of House Moore embroidered on great banners hanging in front of the families, as well the colorful sigils of House Mallistar, Selitgar and Stokeworth, and in the highest balcony sat the Lord Aaron and his family, though his son sat on his wife's lap, shaking and quivering at the loud sounds. That boy is Rob's cousin? John was in neither the stands nor mangled between the common folk. Rather he stood in one of the 2 tents at the edge of the tilts. He had a clear view of both men from here, but a poor view of their clash, only knowing when their lances crossed from the sound of shattering wood and the brief elation of the crowd. Neither man was unmounted, though Bryndon's opponent, a knight of House Burrell, swayed in his saddle as he rode up to John's tent, wordlessly passing by him before heading back towards his own squire and tent. Bryndon circled around as well. His niece, the Lady Aaron's favor, still wrapped around his wrist as he threw his shattered lance into the pile of a dozen others. "What's the score?" Bryndon asked from his horse, a merry look on his face as he extended a hand towards John, which he quickly filled with a fresh lance. "I can hardly see from here." John said it was 1 point for a strike on the shield, 3 for a strike on the shoulder, 5 if they made contact with the head, and an immediate win if someone managed to dismount their opponent. "But I think you're ahead." "Aye," the old knight said, a smile on his lips. In the months that John had been around him, he knew those were rare, but Bryndon seemed to revel in this competition. "I can only imagine it. But better to be sure." John smiled back at his words. That was sentiment he could appreciate well enough. The knight kicked his horse into a full gallop, faster yet than any of his previous charges. His arm was braced and his lance steady. John saw it shatter a moment later, and Ser Burrell hung in the air before slowly disappearing behind his horse as he tumbled into the dirt. The crowd erupted at that. Nothing pleased them more than seeing someone unmounted. Truth be told, it hardly mattered who flew out of their saddle. They were simply happy to see someone triumph. There were rare exceptions. They were silent when Ser Edmund Ambrose, a reachman, unseated Ser Albar Royce, a local and Lord Nestor's son and heir, but that only made the crowd explode when Ambrose was in turn unseated by Lord Belmore. These tournaments seem like such wonderfully festive, competitive things, he thought. I wonder why father dislikes them so? Ser Brynden Blackfish Tully is your winner, shouted the herald from atop a pile of crates towards the roaring crowd. No one expected the Blackfish to be eliminated on the first day regardless of his age, but John had still worried for him. He didn't realize he was so invested, nor that the contest would be so nerve-wracking. And I still have to enter the melee today. Brynden rode back into the tent and John took the lead to his horse as he unmounted. The two made their way out of tent, making space for the clash between Lord Montford Valerion, the Lord of Driftmark, and Ser Samwell Stone, the man-at-arms of Runestone and by far the most fearsome fighter John had sparred against in the last few days. I must cross blades with him again. The knight had found an easy fondness for him, a fellow bastard trying to earn his knighthood, and John had learned more sparring with the man for a few hours than he had in his last month in Winterfell. Do you have much need of me today? John asked innocuously. They made their way across the grounds near the lists. They were surrounded by a dozen tents, each belonging to a knight, some who had already completed their tilts for the day, others who were nervously pacing in anticipation. Do you wish to watch the rest of the joust? Brynden asked. I wish to be in time for the melee. John half lied. Will you be in attendance? I'm too tired, Brynden said. Shaking his head, John let out a sigh of relief. If anyone could recognize him, it would be the Blackfish. Just help me with my armor and go enjoy yourself. The knight went through the flap of his tent while John tied his horse to a post outside before following him in. It was a small and simple thing, only meant to give the knight some privacy on the grounds. Brynden had taken a seat on a stool and drank a deep gulp of water, brushing aside his graying black hair while John moved behind him to undo the straps of his chest plate. A moment later, a familiar man would come through the flaps of the tent, Ser Hersey, the first man the Blackfish had unmounted. He had come to surrender his armor and his horse, but Brynden forgave the debt and waved him off. If you win a joust, you can claim your opponent's horse and armor? John asked. A thoroughbred palfrey cost anywhere from 3 to 10 dragons depending on the age, breed, and spryness. A suit of plate went for 4 to 8 dragons. Is it the same for the melee? No, Brynden said. Much to John's disappointment, he wasn't competing for wealth, but he wouldn't have minded the gold. But I believe Nestor made it so that participants receive a small bounty for every stage they qualify. That sounded a good deal better. Soon Brynden was free of his armor and waved John off. He broke into a sprint once he was out of sight. There was still some time before the jousts concluded and the melee began, but it was a long way to run to where he hid his newly purchased armor. He ran out of the knight's encampment, through the noble pavilions, and into the gates of the moon. The castle was bare, almost completely deserted, save for a stray cat or drunk or lonely servant. Everyone had gone to watch the bouts, so no one saw him make his way towards one of the castle's many storehouses. No one saw him pull away barrels and crates, nor dig through a pile of tarp and empty sheaths until he found the armor that he had bought a week before. He took a moment to marvel at the black steel, to run his hands along its smooth, impenetrable surface. The blacksmith was not wrong. It did have a chilling, almost villainous aura about it, but that only served to endear it further to him. Let them shiver in dread. It took longer than he thought to don it. He had no squire of his own and had to spend minutes contending with the straps on the back. Then there were the accents he had to attach. The armor came with purple velvet, but he had swapped it for a bolt of gray silk, the color of his house. My father's house. He corrected himself, but that did not stop him from draping the gray cloth around his right shoulder and attaching it to his left hip, allowing it to hang loosely around him. Then he slipped into the steel greaves and gauntlets, before strapping the helmet to his head. He rushed back through the castle corridors and noble pavilions towards the tourney grounds. On the way, he tapped into his new-formed connection and flew over the lists. The lists had been turned from 2 long lanes of a joust into a circular arena for the melee, the commoners having been pushed back to make space, and it seems he was too late for the first group of the melee, something which would not have disappointed him so, were it not for who he saw fighting. In the arena were 28 men, though by the time John ran out of the castle, that number had been whittled down to 20 or so. The last 7 men standing would proceed to the next stage, This process would repeat itself 3 more times through 3 more groups of 28. The 7 who qualified from each of the 4 groups would form another band of 28 and would face off again, and the last 7 standing among those would qualify for the final, where the best fighter among them would be crowned the winner and receive a generous bounty of 3,000 gold dragons. Every other day would have a round of jousting and 2 groups of the melee, with a day of rest in between until the final day, which would start with the finals of the melee before moving into the semifinals, then finals of the joust, then in the middle of the week on a break day the Squires Games would take place. He could have signed up for those, likely dusted the competition and walked away with a purse of 50 dragons, 5 times the sum his father had given him when he departed Winterfell, but he was not here for gold, nor easy competition. Roderick had told him all he lacked was experience, and he would not find valuable experience in any children's tourney. He was here for the best. And the best, it seems, had been drafted into the first group of the melee, one he had just missed. Ser Cressy was a terror. The giant swung his greatsword with enough force to send men flying off their feet, but still knew how to defend and retreat when needed. Another standout was lowly hedge knight of no renown. He fought viciously and brutally, preferring to send his foes unconscious rather than demand surrender, and nothing was beneath him. From dirt in the eyes to tricking his opponents into believing he was surrendering, Jon found it distasteful, but realized he should be prepared to face such tactics in the group he joined. But by far the most extraordinary performance in the first group was by Ser Corbray. He was more akin to a flurry of steel and force than a mortal man with a sword, to the point that the entire melee seemed to center around him. Men would scurry out from his path. Sometimes 2 men engaged in a desperate duel would notice his approach and call a piece to hold him off, and on rare occasions the foolhardy would seek him out. Those lasted the shortest. He wielded only a bastard sword, but he regularly switched which hand was holding the steel. If they were used to wide arcs from the right and small, quick strikes from the left, he would switch hands and completely throw them off, and he always unleashing a brutal attack whenever he swapped, a strike with slightly more reach and much more force than any of his opponents expected. He wreaked havoc on the competition, putting down as many as 5 other knights by his lonesome. Among his victims were lowly hedge knights and powerful lords like Lord Grafton and Lord Linderley. This was a man who'd managed to best Kingsguard in the Battle of the Trident before he was even a man of 20. This was the measure Jon had come south to match. Right now, he was engaged with the second largest man in the arena, Ser Lal Crakehall, who was visiting from the Westerlands. The man fought with a savage sword in one hand and a massive shield that seemed all but impermeable in the other. Jon had previously seen it holding back as many as half a dozen men at once in the training yards, but Corbray's blows would land on the right spots with such ungodly force that it left the giant reeling back, unable to find his footing and unable to return the offensive. The scene resembled a bear being pushed around by a wasp. The melee was nearing its conclusion now. 10 men remained standing, but Jon could see thousands of eyeballs fixated on the fight between those 2. Corbray seemed to revel in the attention almost as much as Crakehall was annoyed by it, often showboating between strikes as the larger man's face grew redder and redder. Eventually Corbray went for a risky maneuver, so risky that someone as frustrated as Crakehall would have no way of expecting it. The Veil Man began an assault that would have sent any other man to the ground. He neglected his defense completely and accepted a few grazing blows on his arm and helmet, sacrificing safety for more attacks. Then he relaxed his assault, allowing the other man to stand straight and push forward again. Corbray took advantage of the change in momentum to hook his blade onto the side of the shield and pushed it aside, before charging forward. Now he was behind the larger man's shield. Crakehall had been too stunned and taken aback to do much of anything and fell victim to a basic trip. A moment later, a foot landed on his chest and a blade to his throat as the roars of thousands reached the eyrie. I cannot believe I missed the chance to face him. Jon shook his head awake, his hawk flying away towards the mountains. What is this connection to the bird? He wondered, but not for long. There was only one more group of the melee being played today, and he was getting into it. He felt the same mix of anxiety and excitement that had become a constant these last few days, but this time greater than he had ever felt before, and his hands shook as he balled them up, his breathing quickened, and every second seemed to stretch. But the closer he got to the tourney grounds, the louder the crowd grew and the more his worries faded into determination, until he was met with a wall of noise to match the army of people standing out ahead of him. Commoners darted out of his way. A few children tried to grab at his feet while their parents tore them off and bowed their heads. A few maidens turned in adoration only for their expressions to turn fearful when caught sight of his armor. Once beyond the crowd, he hurried his step to approach the armored men gathered at the edge of the arena. Next to them was an armory of dulled steel weapons and wooden shields. Jon usually preferred a great two-handed sword, but he had practiced something else for the tourney. He hurried to lay claim to both a bastard sword, which was a hand shorter than his usual greatsword, and an arming sword which was hand shorter than a normal sword. He strapped one on his back and the other on his hip. Most of the other men didn't even seem to register him. Some were shaking in place. Others were all smiles and boasts, old men with crowds of hopeful greenbloods hanging on their every word and bored lords awaiting the clash. He saw a few of Michael's brothers. He saw the Bronze's Yon's eldest son and knights bearing the sigils of House Linderly and Brune on their shields, even saw the Lion of House Lannister, and lastly stood the Game Master with a wax pad in hand, the same man who had rejected Jon's participation in the melee some weeks ago on account of him not having a knighthood. And he still lacked one. All he had was a knight's armor and whatever false impression he could muster. It's a game of flush, he thought, small deceptions and stoicism. The man was waving them into the arena one by one. While crossing away at his wax pad as he did, Jon fell in step with the rest of the men. He hoped to just slip by, but when it came to be his turn, the Game Master extended a hand to stop him, his expression turning confused. "Who are you?" the man asked. "A mystery knight," Jon said, trying to deepen his voice to disguise it. "I can see that much, but were you meant to compete today?" the Game Master asked, raising an eyebrow. "What's your name?" "I can hardly just say it aloud," Jon said, crossing his arms and raising his chin, trying to channel Maya during their Fry kidnapping. "I do not care if you fumbled your groups. I prepared to compete today and I am competing today. I cannot allow it." "I hardly care for what you allow," Jon said, raising his voice and arms. He should have felt his heart drop in panic, but he enjoyed confrontation a little too much. "Can we move it along?" the man behind him said, a tall man, near 7 foot. He wore an open-faced helmet and his ugly mug was on display for all. "I'll put our mystery knight down in the first minute, and all will be fine. It must be 4 groups of 20. You will choke on your words," Jon said, pushing aside the Game Master's arm and entering the arena. He turned to look up at the giant behind him, but in truth his eyes were on the Game Master, wondering if he would escalate, if he would call the guards, if he would have Jon exposed. But the man only looked flustered. He lowered his eyes back to his wax pad and returned to gesturing men inside. A small man with an even smaller pad of wax. He thought, he was never going to stop me. Now that he was inside the circle, he saw the countless eyes on him, both noble and common-born. Hundreds of small folk were kept at bay by a fence of wood and a few guardsmen. There were so many bodies that the reek from it assaulted his nostrils. Then in the noble stands, he saw lords from across the Vale and the rest of kingdoms, noble ladies who had been watching all day and lords who had participated in the joust hours before, men and women he knew and others he had only exchanged looks with. Their low whispers morphed into a steady hum, and scattered about the nobles and small folk alike were many pointed fingers and money changing hands. And yet, he was almost completely at ease. Perhaps it was the helmet or the identity he was hiding behind. Perhaps it was the relief of finally bypassing the Game Master. Or perhaps he had always been this comfortable with attention, but he'd never had the chance to find out. But all that mattered was that he was as cold as the winds of his homeland. Calmer now than he had been all day. It was his tournament life on the line rather than Bryndon's. This was his story to write. "My lords and ladies, the second round of the melee," the herald called out, his voice overriding the murmur of the crowd and near deafening him this close as he unsheathed his weapons. How is he so loud? "It shall commence in 5, 4, 3, 2. The herald did not have time to finish before the arena descended into chaos. The 7-foot, ugly giant seemed intent on making good on his promise of eliminating Jon immediately. Jon did not think when he saw the monster rushing him with a sword overhead. He never did. He only acted. A brutal blow connected with man's knee. Jon had to dart out of the way to avoid the collapsing body before striking him on the back of the head as he fell to the ground. He felt a familiar fire surge in his veins at the sight, the same fervor that burned in him during the squire's war games, but increased tenfold, spurred by the screaming crowds and armored men around him. It sharpened his mind to an edge, dulled the pain from any blows he took, and his swords would reap a cruel bounty across the lists. The first man he approached was one bearing the twin towers of House Frey on his shield. The man was standing to the side, likely hoping to scrape by and survive for the next round, and while Jon may have had his vengeance on the boy who set Harding on him, his disdain for the Freys and their liege was not so quickly forgotten. The Frey's eyes widened as he noticed a suit of black and gray plate running towards him. He took a step back as Jon leapt off his feet, then brought his shield up to block Jon's bastard sword. The dulled steel bounced off the wood, but he felt the knight's shield arm weaken from the blow. He unleashed a relentless assault on the Frey, not of the undull, nor the northern style, rather something entirely of his creation, practiced to perfection over countless grueling days and sleepless nights. Heavy, unstoppable blows rained from his bastard sword. He would strike down, then up then across in a fluid motion, and with every strike he saw the man's blocks grow sloppier and his knees buckle more and more. Then when the knight tried to attack him back, he would rest the bastard sword on his shoulder and turn his stance to make use of the arming sword in his other hand, blocking blows as Brynden and Roland had taught him, then retaliating with quick slashes as to never let up the attack. The Frey tried to back up and catch his breath, but another overwhelming barrage of strikes from his bastard sword would descend on him. The knight's grip faltered, then failed, and with his shield in the mud, the man raised his arms in surrender. The combination of weapons was Jon at his best and most aggressive. It was highly volatile and took immense strength, endurance, and skill to execute, but he had all three in spades, and the payoff made him unstoppable. He felt a violent strike on his shoulder, one which dented his armor and would leave a nasty bruise in the coming days, but in the moment, it barely registered as a thud. He spun around with a fierce swing of his bastard sword, but the man who struck him had managed to parry perfectly, sending a painful jolt up Jon's arm. The man wore a helmet that obfuscated his face, but on his shield was the golden tree of House Rowan, and Jon realized who the man was quickly enough: Lord Mathis Rowan. He had not crossed blades with him in training, but he saw the lord demolishing many a man at the yard. By every measure, he had the might to qualify for the next round of the melee at the very least. Finally, Jon thought, "I've traveled 1,000 miles for you, my lord." And he only had one chance to win, or he would be eliminated for good, likely never fight a man of this caliber for a long time. He started with 2 quick slashes of his arming sword. The lord parried them perfectly again, and before Jon could continue, the man counterattacked with a thrust and slash. His movements both graceful and robust, Jon deflected the first and parried the second, before retaliating with a strike of his bastard sword. The clashing of steel fell into rhythm with the beating of his heart. His armor and silk grew filthy with dirt and sweat as two of them kept matching blows, a dance which pushed both lord and bastard to the edge, an exhausting affair of flying steel where both men were desperate to attain any kind advantage. Then he heard it. Another sound had joined the chorus. He thought it coincidence at first, but soon noticed that the cheers of the crowd were in sync with their song of steel. "All eyes on me." The energy of crowd poured into him, feeding his sapping stamina. They gave a speed and strength to his blows he thought he had grown too tired for. He struck twice with his arming sword, then instantly flowed into a flurry of strikes from his bastard sword, each more powerful than the last. But when it looked like he was done, he brought up his sword once more, but rather than a slash or strike, he thrust the blade over his head. It slipped past Lord Rowan's shield and struck the man directly on the throat. Jon roared as the lord fell gasping for air on the ground. 1,000 cries matched his. Littered around him were a dozen more bodies which had fallen to duels and fights of their own. He could have kept his head down, fought to survive and made the next round, but he was not done yet, not with a ravenous bloodthirst pushing him forward. "You!" He yelled towards a random man. He did not know who he was. He did not recognize the sigil on his shield, but he did not care. He charged towards him, reveling in the momentary look of fear on the man's face. then spun to strike him with both blades at once. It pushed the exhausted man's shield aside and allowed Jon an uninterrupted double strike to the man's shoulder, sending him down with a thud. He sprinted towards two others engaged in a duel. He reared his foot back and kicked one in the shield. He went flying to the ground. Then Jon began destroying the other man's guard with a torrent of steel. The second round of the melee is concluded. He heard the herald yell. His voice hit him like a bucket of cold water. He almost continued his rampage, but found the presence of mind to stop himself. And your winners are Ser Andar Royce, Ser Davin Lannister, Ser William the Hedge Knight, Ser Jasper Redfort, Lord Baron Elisham, Lord Theomar Smallwood, and the Ashen Reaver.